Dance of Death. Terry took Nikki's hands and twirled her. All around him, everyone was laughing, dancing, shouting, and changing partners. In the eerie light, it was hard to see who was dancing with whom. It was fun, but it went on and on. Whenever Terry started to slow down, the music went faster. Then suddenly, the lights went out. The tape player died down with a sad groan. For a moment, there was dead silence. Except for the faint glow from the fireplace, the room was in total darkness. "What is this, Justine? Another surprise?" asked Murphy's voice after a moment. "I don't know what happened," said Justine. She sounded a little frightened. "Uncle Philip?" "I'll check the fuse box," Philip's voice said calmly. "Don't go away." At that moment, the artificial candles came back on, and the tape started up again. But no one felt like dancing anymore, because the light showed a horrifying sight. In front of the fireplace, half on and half off the hearth rug, lay a limp body. Blood trickled down its side from the huge carving knife sticking out of its back. Halloween Party by R.L. Stine. Chapter 1. The tombstone loomed gray in the moonlight, its edges eroded into irregular shapes. Thick moss covered the words etched into its surface, except for a line at the bottom. Died, October 31st, 1884. Terry Ryan tried to step quickly past the ancient monument, but his girlfriend, Nikki Mayer, pulled on his hand to stop him. "Look, Terry," she said. "The person in this grave died on this same day over 100 years ago." Nikki stepped closer, her flashlight casting a dim yellow arc of light on the gravestone. Terry pulled his jacket tighter. The wind howled, sounding like the wail of a creature long dead. Somewhere, something scratched and rattled against stone. "I don't believe I'm standing in the middle of the Fear Street Cemetery at night," Terry thought. He took Nikki's hand again and gave it a gentle squeeze. She turned to him, her beautiful dark eyes bright with excitement. In her red gown and black cape, she looked like a medieval princess. "I wonder who all these people were," she said, gesturing at the crumbling gravestones. "Early settlers of Shadyside, probably," said Terry. "Nobody's been buried here for years." "It's spooky here," Nikki said, "but kind of beautiful, too. How do you suppose all those stories got started, about the living dead coming out of their graves?" "Just stories," he said. "Come on, let's go." The wind gusted, and Terry saw Nikki shiver inside her cape. They began walking again, and Terry picked a path through the weed-choked lanes between the grave markers. With their every step, the ground creaked, a sound like breaking bones. Somewhere above them, the wind shrieked, tearing at a branch. Terry stole a glance at Nikki. Her eyes were sparkling with excitement. The howling wind doesn't bother Nikki, Terry thought. Nikki had been nearly deaf since an accident in second grade. But she spoke so clearly and read lips so well, most people didn't even realize she had a handicap. Nikki herself never acted as if she was different from other kids. She never wanted special treatment at all. In fact, just the opposite. Nikki was always ready for adventure. But was she ready for tonight? They were almost at the end of the shortcut that led to the edge of the graveyard. Beyond the cemetery's stone wall, Terry could see the outline of the old Cameron mansion. The tall trees around it were whipping from side to side. From this distance, it looked as if the house were slowly shaking itself. The wooden gate at the edge of the wall hung open. Without realizing it, Terry began to walk a little faster. Nikki tugged on his hand again. "I dropped my mask back there," she said. "It'll take just a second to get it." Holding the flashlight on her feet, Nikki quickly retraced her steps. "Not so fast," Terry called. Then he remembered she couldn't hear him. She ducked behind the tombstone she'd been examining. "I've got it," she called. Terry slipped on a moss-covered rock, then quickly pulled himself up and headed to the tombstone. Even if the scary stories weren't true, he didn't want to let Nikki out of his sight. He had almost reached the tombstone when a sudden high-pitched scream split the air. "Nikki!" he called. His heart thudding, he lunged behind the tombstone. Nikki was there, brushing the dirt off her black silk mask. "What's wrong?" she asked when she saw his face. "I heard a—" the scream repeated. "There it is again," he said. He put his arm around Nikki and held her tight. The sound had come from the direction of the gate. He thought of going back the way they had come and walking around the cemetery, but it would take too long. Besides, he wanted to get out of the graveyard as soon as possible. With the flashlight in one hand and his other arm around Nikki, Terry walked cautiously toward the gate. They had nearly reached it when a tall, dark figure suddenly jumped into the path in front of them. Nicky let out a shriek and pressed tighter against Terry. Blocking the path was a figure from a nightmare. The thing's black clothing hung in tatters. Its face, or whatever was left of it, seemed to be rotting away, and the flesh on its hands was peeling off the bones. This wasn't happening, Terry thought. That thing can't be real. His hands shaking, he pushed Nicky behind him and raised the flashlight threateningly. Can a weapon hurt the living dead? He wondered. But before he could find out, the figure suddenly reached up and ripped its head off, revealing the grinning face of Murphy Carter. It took Terry a moment to realize that the gruesome head was only a mask. "Gotcha," Murphy said. "Boy, you two were scared to death. You should have seen your faces." "Yeah, sure," Terry said, hoping his voice wasn't shaking. "We knew it was you all along." "Sure you did," Murphy said. "And my grandmother's the mayor of Shadyside." He grinned at Nicky, then gestured with one of the gloves that looked like a rotting hand. "Come on, let's go," he said. "We wouldn't want to be late for this party." Chapter 2. 2 weeks earlier. Sometimes Terry thought he tried to do too many things. Sometimes he knew he did. That week alone, in addition to his regular schoolwork and after-school job, he had to turn in a science project and chair a student council meeting. He also promised his little sister he'd help her learn to ride her new bicycle. His head was full of projects. He had to twirl the combination on his locker twice before he could get it open. And after he did, he realized he'd been meaning to clean out his locker. It was hard to believe so much junk could fit inside such a small space. Carefully, Terry began to push aside his jacket, his tennis racket, half a dozen books, and the props from his science project. "It's here somewhere," he told himself. "I know it is." "What's somewhere?" asked a voice behind him. Terry turned, startled, to see Tricia McCormick standing behind him. Tricia was a short brunette with wiry hair and a bit of a weight problem. She was also the most friendly and enthusiastic person Terry knew. "Hi, Tricia," he said. "What did you say?" "Who are you talking to?" asked Tricia. Myself," Terry said. "I'm a real good listener." "Sorry," Tricia said, giggling. "Didn't mean to eavesdrop." "I was looking for my lunch," Terry explained. "Aha, there it is." Triumphantly, he pulled the rumpled brown bag from the jumble, noting with dismay that one whole side of it was wet. Shoving the rest of the stuff back in his locker, he slammed the door. As he did, a piece of paper fluttered to the floor. "What's that?" said Tricia. "I don't know," said Terry. He picked it up and examined it. It was a plain white envelope with a black border. On the front, in ornate lettering, was his name, Terry Ryan. "Would you hold my lunch?" he asked Tricia. Curious, he opened the envelope. Inside was a stiff white card with a picture of a coffin on it. Beneath the coffin was written, "Reserved for you." "A coffin?" Terry said, starting to laugh. "What is this? An ad for a funeral parlor?" "Turn it over," Tricia said. Terry did as she suggested. The other side was filled with writing. "Hey," he said. "It's an invitation to a Halloween party at Justine Cameron's place, right?" Tricia said. "Yeah," Terry said. "How did you know?" "I got one too," Tricia said. "Probably everyone in school did, but read what the invitation says. It's really weird." "All night Halloween costume party," Terry read. "All night. Hey, that's cool. Where's the weird part?" "Keep going," said Tricia. "Special surprises," Terry read. "Dancing, games. I don't see what's so—" "Did you read where it is?" said Tricia. "Cameron Mansion, 8 p.m. Friday night, October 31st, Terry read. "So?" "So that's the old Cameron Mansion," said Tricia. "The one that's out behind the cemetery on Fear Street." "You're kidding. How could anyone have a party there? No one's lived in that place for years," Terry said. "Justine and her uncle live there now," said Tricia. "They're fixing it up. I know because my father's firm is doing the electrical work." "Wasn't that house supposed to be haunted?" Terry asked. "Everything on Fear Street is supposed to be haunted," said Tricia. "Here's your squashed lunch back." "Thanks," said Terry. As he and Tricia walked to the lunchroom, he thought about some of the things he'd heard about Fear Street. Although perfectly ordinary people lived in some of its beautiful old houses, other homes were deserted and rumored to harbor evil spirits. Terrible things had happened on Fear Street. Murders, mysterious disappearances. It seemed like the perfect spot for a Halloween party. "Why do you suppose Justine invited us to her party?" Trisha asked Terry at the cafeteria door. Terry shrugged. "Beats me," he said. "I don't even know her. I just know what she looks like." Everyone in the school knew what Justine looked like, Terry thought. She was the most beautiful girl at Shadyside High, maybe in the whole town. Even the girls thought so. She was tall and slim, and looked more like a model than a student, with her long shiny blonde hair and eyes as green as jade. Justine was a transfer student, new to Shadyside High, and so far, hardly anyone had gotten to know her, though most of the boys had tried. Terry was about to ask Trisha more about Justine when he spotted Nikki sitting at a table by the door. He excused himself and slid in across from Nikki so she'd be able to read his lips. "Hi, funny face," he said, calling her by his special pet name. "Hi, Terry," Nikki said, giving him a big smile. Terry suddenly felt like the most important person in the world. Nikki always had that effect on him. He'd been going with her for 6 months now, and he still couldn't believe his good fortune. Nikki wasn't the prettiest girl at Shadyside, or the smartest, but she was definitely the most special. When she came into a room, everybody automatically felt happier. When Nikki smiled, her even white teeth flashing against her smooth olive skin, it was like the sun coming up. "What you been up to?" Nikki asked him. "Not much," Terry said. "But look at this." He handed her the invitation. "I got one too," said Nikki. "Maybe everyone in school did," Terry said. "I don't think so," said Nikki. "No one else in my homeroom got one, and none of my friends, like Jade and Dina, were invited." "I wonder why she invited us," said Terry. "I don't even know her. Do you?" "Not very well," Nikki admitted. "She's in my gym class, and I've played basketball with her, but we've hardly spoken to each other." Terry opened his lunch, noting that the leak was coming from his meatloaf and tomato sandwich, which had somehow gotten completely smashed. "Ugh," he said, looking at the gooey mess. "Here, have half of mine," said Nikki. She always ate the same thing, a peanut butter and banana sandwich with celery and carrot sticks on the side. "That's okay," said Terry. "Maybe I'll get a hot dog from the vending machine." "I can't believe the junk you eat," said Nikki. "At least have some carrot sticks." Terry took one and began to munch. "What are you going to go as?" asked Nikki. "What?" "To Justine's party. It's a costume party, remember?" "Oh, I don't know," said Terry. "Maybe we ought to skip it. None of our friends are going, and we really don't know Justine." "So what?" said Nikki. "I love costume parties. Besides, I've never been to a party on Fear Street." "It would definitely be a first," said Terry. "So it's settled," said Nikki. "Besides, I'd like to get to know Justine better." "What's she like in gym?" Terry asked. "She's the best athlete in the class," said Nikki. "She's in really great shape. I asked her about it once, and she told me she lifts weights." Terry let out a low whistle. "Whoa," he said. "No wonder she's so—" He let the thought trail off. "She's so what?" said Nikki. She had a dangerous glint in her eyes. "So, you know," he said, stifling a grin. He looked closely at Nikki to see if she was really upset or was just teasing him. "So, stacked?" Nikki suggested. "Well, yeah," said Terry. Nikki burst out laughing. "You boys are all alike," she said. "I wonder who Justine asked to the party as her date." For the rest of the day, no one talked about anything but Justine and her party. Everyone had heard about it, even though not that many people had been invited. Just before the bell rang for the last period, Lisa Bloom stopped Terry in the hall. Lisa was assistant editor of the school paper, and she usually knew everything that was going on. In fact, she was a real gossip, except she called it being a reporter. "I hear you were invited to Justine's party," she said to Terry. "Why do you think she asked you?" "I don't have any idea," said Terry. "You're the reporter. Maybe you can tell me." "My theory is she wants to get to know people better," said Lisa. "But she's shy about it because of all the awful stories about the house where she lives." "What are you talking about?" "Don't you know?" said Lisa. "The last owners of the Cameron mansion were killed in some kind of accident years ago. The story is that no one could ever live there again because their spirits haunt the place." "Nice story. So why is Justine living there?" asked Terry skeptically. Lisa shrugged. According to my aunt, Justine is a distant cousin of the original owners. Her uncle inherited the place and decided to fix it up. I heard she lives there with her uncle. He's her guardian, said Lisa. I guess her parents are dead, or divorced, or something. Supposedly, Justine and her uncle have lived all over the country, and even in Europe. Terry knew that Lisa's information was usually right, but he didn't see what Justine had to do with him and Nikki. He was still puzzling the matter over in biology class when Ricky Shore sat down next to him. Ricky was an obnoxious practical joker, and some people considered him the biggest dweeb in the whole school. Ricky's thick black hair was uncombed as usual, and as usual, he was wearing a tacky t-shirt no one else would be caught dead in. This one was stained with orange juice and said, "Kiss me, I'm a Martian." "Hey, Shore," said Terry. "Yo, Terry," said Ricky. He sat a rumpled paper sack down on the lab table separating them. "I heard you and Nikki got invited to Justine's party." "That's right," said Terry. "So did I," said Ricky. "Huh? No bull?" Terry was surprised. He couldn't imagine why Justine had chosen him and Nikki, but it was even weirder that she had asked Ricky and Tricia. None of them hung out together. "I wonder who else is going," Ricky said. "Have you heard?" "Nope," said Terry. "How's your biology project coming?" he asked, deliberately changing the subject. "I'm just about done," said Ricky. "In fact, I've got it in here." He pointed to the paper sack. Terry looked at the sack in disbelief. It was throbbing and beginning to inch across the lab table. "I hate to tell you," he said, "but your science project seems to be trying to escape." Ricky opened the sack. Instantly, a small green frog leaped out and began hopping along the table. Terry grabbed for it and held it distastefully in his hands. "This is your biology project, Shore?" he said. "A frog?" "It's not the whole thing," said Ricky, looking hurt. He reached in the bag and pulled out a jar of murky water. "My project is on metamorphosis," he said. "I've got tadpoles in here." Terry gazed at the jar doubtfully. "You mean you had tadpoles?" he said. "Those aren't moving." "Let me see," said Ricky. He took the jar and studied it closely, turning it first one way, then the other. Then he shook it. "I guess I should have cut air holes in the lid," he said finally. "Oh well, that's life, huh? Here today, slimy and disgusting tomorrow. I can always pick up some more at the pond." Terry handed him the frog, and he shoved it and the jar of dead tadpoles back into the sack. "Great project, Shore," Terry said sarcastically. "Just call me Mr. Wizard," Ricky said. "So who else is invited to the party?" Ricky asked after a moment. "I don't know," said Terry. "Tricia McCormick. I don't know anyone else." "Murphy Carter," said Ricky. Murphy Carter was the first name on the list that made sense to Terry. Murphy was a linebacker on the football team and was known as an all-around party guy, but he had nothing in common with the rest of them. Terry was about to ask Ricky more when Mr. Rothrock came in, ready to talk about genetics, and for the next 40 minutes, Terry forgot all about the party. But after school, walking outside to meet Nikki, he passed a crowd gathered on the front steps. Lisa Bloom was talking to a small crowd of students. Nikki caught up with him on the sidewalk and took his elbow. "Hi, Terry," she said. "How was your day?" "Weird," Terry said honestly. "How about you?" "Pretty weird, too. I feel like a celebrity because of the invitation to the party." "Which way do you want to walk home?" Terry asked. "I guess by the—" "Wait a minute," said Nikki. "Lisa's reading off a list." She squinted to where Lisa was speaking. Maybe to make up for her deafness, Nikki's eyesight was great, and she could read lips across the room. "She's figured out everyone who's invited to the party," Nikki said. "It's 9 people." "Only 9?" said Terry. "That's what she says. There's you and me, Tricia, Ricky Shore, Murphy Carter, Angela Martiner, Les Whittle, David Summers, and Alex Beale." "Alex? Oh, wonderful," Terry muttered sarcastically. For years, he and Alex had been best friends. They had grown up together, played tennis together, even gone out with girls together. Until last year, when Nikki had stopped going with Alex and started dating Terry. Alex had never gotten over his feelings for Nikki, and sometimes Terry wondered if Nikki was over her feelings for Alex. "This whole list is bizarro," Nikki was saying. "None of us hang out together, except maybe Murphy and David." David, like Murphy, was on the football team and also played basketball. Angela was a slim, pretty redhead with a fast reputation, and Les was a science whiz who kept to himself. Terry couldn't think why any of them had been invited, but if Alex Beale was on the list, he was definitely glad that he was too. "Oh, look," said Nicky. "Here comes Justine. Maybe she'll explain the list." Justine came walking briskly out the front door of the school. As she did, the crowd moved closer to her. Reluctantly, Terry followed Nicky up on the steps. "Where have you been all day?" someone asked Justine. "I had a doctor's appointment in Waynesbridge," said Justine. "I just got back for last period." "Come on," said Lisa. "Explain your guest list." "What's to explain?" said Justine sweetly. "I'm just having a party." "I've got it," said Murphy Carter. "If you look at the list, everyone invited is either a jock or a wimp, or someone's girlfriend. Is that it, Justine?" "I'm sorry. I don't know what you're talking about," she said with a shrug. "I just invited some people I want to get to know better." She was wearing a body-hugging white wool dress, and with her frosty blonde hair and green eyes, she looked more like a model than ever. "I like Murphy's idea," said David. "The wimps and the jocks." "So what do you think, wimp?" asked Murphy, spotting Terry. "You got the guts to go to the party and stay all night?" "I hope you'll all come to the party," said Justine. She turned her dazzling smile on Murphy. "Can I count on you, Murphy?" she said. Sure," he said, suddenly looking goofy. "You can count on me, too," said David. "I'm glad," said Justine. "Now, both of you have to promise that you'll dance with me. I have a really rad sound system, and I bought a lot of excellent dance CDs. Justine was laying it on pretty thick, and Terry could see that Murphy and David were buying it. "Hey, I'd like to dance with you," said Bobby McCory, who had appeared from somewhere with his buddy, Marty Danforth. Bobby was on the varsity football team, but he had a bad temper, and most of the other guys didn't hang out with him. He and Marty were the biggest bullies in the school. "Well, I'd like to dance with you too, Bobby," said Justine, her voice suddenly sarcastic. "Why don't you come to my aerobics class?" The other kids laughed, and Bobby glared at them before turning back to Justine. "Why don't I come to your party instead?" he said. "You probably just forgot to send me an invitation, right?" "No," said Justine, smiling again. "I didn't forget." "Well, you'd better change your mind," said Bobby with a scowl. "Me and Marty don't like being left out of things." "I'm sorry you feel that way," said Justine. "But this is a small party, and you guys just aren't on the list." "We'll see about that," said Bobby menacingly. "Come on, Marty," he added. "Let's leave these dorks and go have some fun." He and Marty stalked away, then jumped on their motorcycles and roared off. Terry had a feeling they weren't giving up, but Justine didn't seem at all concerned. "Hey, Justine, what about dates?" Murphy asked. "I can bring my girlfriend, can't I?" "It's not a party for dates," said Justine. "It's not that kind of party at all." "But Monica and I have been going together for 2 years," said Murphy. "Then I'm sure she won't mind giving you a little space just for one night," said Justine. Terry and Nicky were turning to leave when the front door of the school swung open with a bang. Alex Beale came swaggering down the steps, his huge, muscular frame seeming to take up all of the space a foot around him. Terry had to admit that Alex was good-looking, with his short blonde hair, his confident smile, his laughing, dark eyes. As soon as he got close to Justine, he winked. "Got your invitation," he said. "Good," said Justine. "I hope I can count on you." "Oh, you can count on me," said Alex. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What comes after 5, Alex? Terry thought. The sight of Alex always made Terry feel uneasy and sarcastic these days. "I knew I could count on you, Alex," Justine said, smiling again. She turned and gave a little wave to the kids who were still there. "See the rest of you later," she said, and strolled out of the parking lot. Terry took Nicky's hand and tugged gently, but before they could get down the steps, Murphy Carter's voice cut through the noise. "Hey, Terry," he said. "Wimp, where are you going so fast?" "We're going home," said Terry. "What do you think?" "Right," said Murphy. "But you never answered my question." Quickly, he explained to Alex about the invitations going either to wimps or jocks. "So I asked Terry if he thought he could go the distance and stay all night." "Good question," said Alex, laughing. "Can you?" "Oh, wow, a haunted house," said Terry. "I'm shaking in my shoes." "Even if it's on Fear Street?" Alex asked. It's just another street as far as I'm concerned, said Murphy. All that garbage about evil things happening there is just superstition. I'm not so sure about that, said Alex thoughtfully. Now who's the wimp? Cracked Murphy, slightly confused. Hey Alex, whose side are you on? Give me a break, Murphy, Alex said, rolling his dark eyes. Halloween on Fear Street? I'm ready. He turned back to Terry, an odd smirk on his handsome face. Think you and the wimps will be able to stay all night in a haunted house? I've got no problem with it, said Terry. But are you sure your mommy will let you stay out after dark? Alex ignored Terry's shot and called to Ricky Shore, who was headed to the parking lot, carrying the paper bag with his dead biology project. Hey, Shore, he shouted. How about you? You going to join Terry's team and show up at the party? Sure, I'll show up, said Ricky. And I'm not a wimp. Alex, David, and Murphy laughed. I love it, said Murphy. He's not a wimp. He doesn't have the guts to be a wimp, cried David. The three of them started laughing all over again, slapping one another high fives. So who else is on your team, Terry? Asked Alex. Les Whittle, maybe? And Trisha? Think they'll have the guts to go? Ask them yourself, said Terry. He took a deep breath. Nikki gave him a worried look, then turned to the jocks. Come on, guys, she said. This isn't a contest. It's a party. Why can't we all just... Sorry, Nikki, said Murphy. Maybe it started out as a party, but it's a contest now. Us against them. The jocks against the wimps. Terry stood there a moment, exasperated. Alex was always trying to show him up. Why couldn't he just accept that Nikki was his girlfriend now? Find someone else to play your games, he said finally. Come on, Nikki. In other words, said Alex, you're too chicken to go. In that case, Nikki, maybe you'd better join our team. Sounds like Terry's not sure he can protect you. I can take care of Nikki, obviously better than you, Terry shouted, losing his temper and immediately feeling embarrassed about it. Will you both stop acting like children? Nikki shouted. I can take care of myself. And for your information, I'm not on any so-called team. That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Oh yeah? Said Alex, looking stung. Maybe you ought to think twice about that. He took a step forward, his face suddenly dark with anger. Take it easy, Alex, Terry said. Nobody meant anything. It's just a party, all right? It's more than that now, muttered Alex, and you know it. He turned and walked quickly to the parking lot. The crowd of kids began to break up. Yo, Captain Wimp, Ricky cheerfully called from across the parking lot. We're going to cream those guys, huh, dude? They don't have a chance, Terry called back, suddenly into the competition without realizing it. We'll show them who the real wimps are, and it's not us. He started to reach for Nikki's hand, but stopped in surprise. She was standing still and staring up at him, her face full of misery. Hey, funny face, he said. What's the matter? This stupid contest, she said, frowning. Why do you let those guys push you into it? Nobody pushed me into anything, said Terry. Besides, it's nothing to worry about. It's just a goof. To you, maybe, Nikki said. But not to Alex. Didn't you see his face? He's serious about this. Deadly serious. Chapter 3. Terry's parents readily agreed to let him go to the all-night party, but only because Justine's uncle was going to chaperone. Nikki's parents were harder to persuade, but when Nikki showed them the costume she'd spent hours making, they finally gave in. Meanwhile, Terry, Ricky, Les, and Trish, the Wimp team, were thinking up tricks to play on the jocks. Terry only joined in half-heartedly, knowing that the real competition was between Alex and him. Nikki absolutely refused to have anything to do with any competition or pranks, but she was really looking forward to the party. Meanwhile, every day at school was like April Fool's Day. At first, it was just harmless fun. One morning the jocks dissed Ricky Shore with a huge plastic snake that jumped out of his locker. Then, Les got even by sneaking into the locker room and filling Alex and Murphy's basketball shoes with shaving cream. The day after that, Trisha received a phone call from someone who told her she had won 1,000 pounds of dead fish in a wimp contest. But then, the pranks turned ugly. 2 days before Halloween, Terry opened his locker and reached for his tennis racket without looking. Something in there brushed against his hand. It felt clammy and cold, like dead fish. Terry dropped the racket in disgust. He took a step back, then forced himself to look down at the racket. Hanging from the strings, a plucked chicken head was staring up at him through sightless eyes. Oh, gross! He picked up the racket and unwrapped the note taped around the handle. Here's a start on your costume, wimp. You'll see worse, unless you chicken out and forget the party. Very mature, Alex, Terry said to the empty hall. He shrugged, then threw the chicken head and the note into the nearest trash can. How could he and Alex have become such enemies, he wondered. He could remember the years growing up, when Alex's family had lived just down the street. They had been such good friends then, inseparable almost. Now they couldn't be together for 5 minutes without getting into some dumb competition. It was dumb, so dumb. But even though he knew it was dumb, Terry still didn't want to lose to Alex. Not now, not ever. On Thursday, before the party, Terry was hurrying to the school library to do some work on his biology project during study period. He'd chosen seed germination for his project because it seemed really interesting. It was really interesting, but it was also a lot more complicated than he had ever imagined. He had tried to germinate some seeds and preserve them in different stages of growth, but nothing would sprout. He was going to have to draw illustrations instead. He rounded the corner just before the library and stopped dead. At the end of the hall was a small group of kids, including Murphy, David, Alex, and Nikki. Nikki was wearing a bright red sweater and a plaid skirt and looked so pretty all he wanted to do was go up and hug her, but she was smiling and talking with Alex. Alex spotted Terry first. He didn't say anything. He just stared at Terry as if he were a bug or some other low form of life. And then he deliberately refocused on Nikki. He bent forward and said something to her, very close to her face. Nikki shook her head quickly, looking annoyed, and the jocks laughed and swaggered off. Terry forced himself to act as if he hadn't seen anything. "Hi, funny face," he said. "Hi, Terry," said Nikki. She smiled, but it wasn't her full smile. She seemed worried, as if something was on her mind. "What was all that about?" he said casually. "What was what all about?" "With Murphy and Alex. What were you talking about?" For a moment, Nikki didn't answer. Then she gave Terry the look that meant he was on dangerous ground. "Why shouldn't I talk to them?" she asked, sounding defensive. "Well, it's just that they're on the other team," Terry said. Then, trying to make a joke out of it, he added, "After all, this is war." But Nikki didn't seem to take it as a joke. "For your information," she said, "it's no such thing. I'm not on either team. Or had you forgotten?" I remembered, but, well, you're going to the party with me, so... "I'll go to the party with you," Nikki said, "but I'll talk to whoever I want." Terry knew she was right. "I'm sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to come on so heavy. It's just that you look sort of worried." "As a matter of fact, I am worried," said Nikki. "This whole party is beginning to seem weirder and weirder." "What do you mean?" "Well, this dumb contest. Justine is really into it too. And I still can't figure out the guest list. This group just doesn't belong together." "I know," said Terry. "But so what?" "And why did she say no one could bring dates?" Nikki went on. "That's not a problem for us," said Terry. "Are you saying you don't want to go?" "No," said Nikki. "But, Terry, be careful. This morning, Angela told me the jocks are cooking up some tricks for the party that could be really dangerous." "Like what?" "I don't know. That's what I was asking Alex about." "What did he say?" "He wouldn't tell me. He just said I should join his team," Nikki replied, even more upset now. "He said it might not be safe for me to go with the wimps." Terry took a deep breath and held it. "What did you tell him?" he asked for a moment. He hated himself for asking, but he had to know. "Oh, I said he was right, and I decided to go with the jocks. What do you think?" The sarcasm in her voice was as heavy as cement, and Terry felt terrible. "Nikki, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "What good does it do to be sorry?" she said. "I can't believe the way you and Alex are acting. You're both taking this whole thing so seriously. Why can't you lighten up and just see it as a party?" "Hey, it's not me who's taking it too seriously," Terry said. "Alex is the one who's playing tricks. He's the one who's threatening you, trying to cause trouble between us." "Will you listen to yourself?" said Nikki, her dark eyes suddenly flashing in anger. "Why don't you just admit that you're as jealous of Alex as he is of you? That's what's really behind this stupid competition." She turned angrily and walked down the hall. Terry thought of going after her, but stopped himself. It wouldn't do any good. When Nicky got that mad, it always took her a while to cool off. Terry had the library all to himself during study period, but he might as well have been in the middle of a crowded train station for all the work he got done on his project. He stared at photographs of seeds, but all he could see was the face of Alex Beale. Whatever Alex was up to, he thought, he wasn't going to get away with it, and Terry refused to be scared off by talk of dangerous tricks. After all, it was just a Halloween party. He expected a few scares on Halloween, trick-or-treat and all that, but as much as he tried to make light of it, Terry couldn't ignore a tiny shiver of foreboding. Terry was on his way from the library to his next class when he heard angry voices just outside the delivery entrance of the cafeteria. He was about to go on by when he heard a small scream and the frightened voice of a girl. "Stop it! You're hurting me!" His heart thudding, Terry pulled the door all the way open. Standing on the service porch were Bobby McCory and Marty Danforth. Between them was Justine, her face pale and her expression frightened. "I can't," Justine was saying. "Don't you understand? The party is already set." "Well, you'd better unset it," said Bobby, sounding really tough. Justine tried to get away, but Marty had hold of her wrist. "Like we told you, Justine," he said. "We don't take no for an answer." Terry walked up to them without even thinking. "All right, you two," he said. "Let her go." "Oh yeah?" said Bobby. "Who says so?" "I do," said Terry. "Come on." "You don't scare me," said Bobby, but he did let go of Justine's wrist. "Come on, Bobby," said Marty. "We can finish this later." "And don't think we won't," added Bobby. He started to go inside, but stopped suddenly and turned to glare at Justine. "You've got till tomorrow night to change your mind," he told her. "Forget it," said Justine. "You're not coming." "We'll see about that. And as far as you, wimp," he added, pointing at Terry, "if you don't stay out of my face, you won't need a Halloween mask." Swaggering, the two bullies disappeared into the hall. Justine stared after them a moment. "Nice guys," she said. "They think they're bad dudes," Terry said. "When it comes down to it, they're probably the two biggest cowards in Shadyside." "Well, I think what you did was really brave," Justine said, giving him a brilliant and somehow intimate smile. "Thank you." Terry noticed that she had her shiny blonde hair pulled back in a braid and was wearing a lime-colored sweater that made her green eyes appear even greener. "Hey, listen, don't worry about those two," said Terry. Then suddenly he realized what he'd done. He'd stood up to the two meanest guys at Shadyside. "I could have been dead meat," he thought. "Was I out of my head or what?" "You were wonderful," Justine said. "Someday I'd like to show you just how grateful I am." She let her smile linger, then went on. "I also want to apologize to you," she added, her musical voice low and intimate. "Apologize?" said Terry, surprised. "For what?" Justine looked embarrassed. I understand that my party invitations may have caused some trouble. That there's some sort of contest?" "Well, yeah," said Terry. "But it's not your fault." "Thank you for saying so," said Justine. "I never meant the party to cause any bad feelings. All I want to do is have a few special people over so I can get to know you all better." For a moment, she slyly rested her fingertips on Terry's arm. He felt a jolt of electricity travel up his arm and then through his body. "Well, hey, I mean, we'd all like to get to know you better too," he stammered. "I mean," Justine continued, "there's no need for a contest. I have plenty of excitement planned without it. The whole idea just seems really silly." "That's what Nicky says too," said Terry. "Nicky, my girlfriend," he added quickly. "In fact, she won't have anything to do with the contest." "Good for her," said Justine. "She's in my gym class, you know. Is it really true she's deaf? Someone told me she was, but it's hard to believe." "It's true," said Terry, "but most people can't tell." "I'm so glad she's coming to the party too," said Justine. "I don't have any close girlfriends in Shadyside, and I have a really special feeling about Nicky." "I'll tell her," said Terry. He left feeling warm inside. This party was really going to be special, he thought, and no one, Not even Alex was going to spoil it for him and Nikki. Nikki was waiting at his locker when school was over. When she saw him walk up, she smiled sheepishly. "Hi, Terry," she said. "Hi, funny face." "I'm sorry I got so mad before," she said. "It's okay," he said. "I'm sorry too. You were right. I've been taking this contest too seriously. I promise from now on to just forget about it and relax." "Good," said Nikki. Terry smiled at her. It was good to see her happy again, and he felt more relaxed than he had all week too. "So, which way should we walk home?" he asked. "The long way or the shortcut?" "I think the long way would be nice, don't you?" said Nikki, squeezing his hand. "You bet," said Terry. The long way would mean an extra 10 minutes of just the two of them alone together. Terry stuffed his gear in his day pack. "Here, let me have your books," he told Nikki. She handed him her stack of books, but as she did, her geography book fell to the floor and a small scrap of paper fluttered out. Idly, she picked it up and glanced at it, then gasped. "What is it?" Terry took the paper from her. In crude block letters, the note said, "You'll wish you were blind, too." Chapter 4. Ice. Ice, Terry thought. He felt frozen to the spot, chilled through. He felt as if he'd turned to ice. And then he felt hot, hot with anger. "I can't believe someone would do such a cruel thing," he said finally. Nikki didn't answer. She just stood there, obviously upset. "There's only one person mean enough to do this," said Terry, "and you know who it is as well as I do." "Don't start anything, Terry, please," said Nikki. "I haven't started anything, but I'm ready to finish something," said Terry heatedly. "Alex is behind this. It can only be Alex." "Terry, no, please don't." Nikki clutched his arm. "It wasn't Alex. Alex likes me. You're wrong. You're not thinking clearly. Listen, Nikki, I know that... You don't know who it was. If you say anything to Alex, it'll only make things worse." "Yeah, but I can't just... Please," Nikki repeated. "Let's just forget it." "Forget it?" Terry was shocked that she could even suggest such a thing. It's just a joke," she said. "It's mean and stupid, but that's all it is. If we pretend it never happened, whoever did it won't get any satisfaction." Terry could see that she was probably right, but he didn't like it. "Just not mention it?" "Right," said Nikki, "and not act upset." "That's going to take an Academy Award-winning performance," said Terry. "Please, Terry, for me," she said. He looked down at her and felt himself melting. At times like this, he knew that Nikki was the most important person in his life, and he would do anything for her. "Okay, funny face," he said. "For you." She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek. "Thanks." "In fact," Terry said, "I have an idea. Let's walk home by way of Pete's Pizza. We can practice our award-winning performances over Cokes." Nikki smiled again, a genuine loving smile. "You're on," she said. Pete's Pizza was one of Shadyside's most popular teen hangouts, and that day it was jammed, both with kids from Shadyside and from the nearby junior college. Terry and Nikki were lucky to find a tiny booth vacant. While they waited for their orders, Terry started telling Nikki about his biology project. It was so noisy in Pete's that he could barely hear anything she said, but she picked up everything he was telling her. He had just gotten to the part about how the seed splits up into two when Nikki interrupted him. "Terry, look," she said, pointing. He followed the direction of her finger and saw Justine standing in a phone booth, a serious look on her face. "Maybe we ought to ask her to join us," Terry said. "She said she wants to get to know you better." "Okay," said Nikki. "We'll just keep an eye on her and..." She stopped speaking, and a strange expression came over her face. Terry took her hand. "What's wrong?" "Nikki, what is it?" "Maybe... nothing," said Nikki. "But... look at Justine." Terry turned to the phone booth again. Justine was still talking into the phone, with an odd, intense look. It was as if she'd changed into a different person, older and cruel. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop," Nikki said, "but I read her lips, and she said, 'They'll pay. Every one of them will pay.'" Chapter 5. Halloween Night. The wind picked up, gusting wildly through the old cemetery, shaking the bare tree limbs like the bony fingers of skeletons. Nicky squeezed Terry's hand as they approached the Cameron mansion. They were following Murphy, who was still chuckling over the scare he'd given them. Suddenly, Nicky wheeled around. 2 other kids were making their way through the cemetery, their costumes glowing in the pale, silvery October moonlight. Everyone had given directions to come the same way. They all had to park in the cul-de-sac at the end of Fear Street and cut through the cemetery to Justine's house at the edge of the woods. In spite of the scare Murphy had given him and Nicky, Terry decided that going through the cemetery had been a great idea. What could be better for putting everyone in a thrills and chills Halloween mood? Up close, the Cameron mansion looked even spookier than it had from the cemetery. It was surrounded on both sides by barren trees that looked as if they must be hundreds of years old. The ground floor windows were covered with heavy iron gates, and beside them, battered wooden shutters banged in the wind. They may be fixing this old house up, Terry thought, but it still resembles something out of a horror movie. Maybe it really is haunted. Just then, there was a break in the wind, and he could hear music and shrieks of laughter from inside. It sounded as if the party had already started. Murphy was clomping up the front steps to the porch, his zombie costume fluttering around him in the wind. Terry sneaked a quick glance at Nicky and squeezed her hand reassuringly. She was dressed as an old-fashioned carnival reveler, in a beautiful red satin ball gown and flowing black cape. She had copied the dress from a book of old party costumes. She was beautiful. Grinning at Terry excitedly, she slid on her shiny black feathered eye mask. Quickly, Terry pulled on his own mask. His mother had helped him dress up as a greaser from the 1950s. He was wearing black chino pants and old saddled shoes of his father's that he'd found in the attic. He had rolled a pack of cigarettes in one sleeve of his tight white t-shirt and had a loose dark jacket over it. His hair was slicked back on the sides with Vaseline and teased up in the front. When he had left his house that evening, he thought he looked pretty cool. But now, he wondered if he just looked silly. Like a wimp. As if reading his thoughts, Nicky reached up and kissed him on the cheek. "You look great, Terry," she said. Terry smiled down at her. "So do you, funny face." He slid up his mask and leaned over to kiss her. She kissed him back, and for a moment, they just stood there, holding each other awkwardly because of their costumes, and kissing. Terry," Nicky said after a moment, "what about the party?" "What party?" said Terry. But he pulled away and smiled down at her again. Then, hand in hand, they mounted the steps up to the vine-choked porch. Murphy must have already gone inside, because the porch was empty. There was a heavy, ornate door knocker in the shape of a skull in the center of the old wooden door. Terry reached out to pull it, when suddenly a huge hairy spider swooped through the air and landed on his arm. Nicky shrieked, and Terry jumped back, his heart pounding. "Gotcha again!" Terry spun around and saw Murphy standing on the railing on the side of the porch, hidden by some of the vines. Cackling maniacally, Murphy jumped onto the porch. The giant rubber bug was on the end of a long pole and rubber band that he jerked up and down like a yo-yo. Murphy laughed. "You two sure scare easy. If all the wimps are as wimpy as you, the jocks will win this contest easy." "Very funny, Murph," said Terry. He took a deep breath and then laughed. Adjusting his mask, he raised his hand to knock again. There was a creaking noise, and the door slowly swung open. Justine's living room was an eerie wonder, the ultimate fantasy of the ultimate Halloween dream, or nightmare. Artificial cobwebs hung in every corner, and cutouts of skeletons, witches, and bats dipped and swooped from the ceiling. Along a narrow balcony above one side of the living room were colored spotlights that seemed to sweep the room in time to the music, their flickering lights causing everything to move eerily. The only other light came from the huge open fireplace, where a big black kettle was boiling, sending greenish fumes bubbling up. All the furniture was from another century, but the music booming from hidden speakers was now. The whole effect was like the world's most modern haunted castle. Even Murphy was impressed. "Wow," he said, stopping just inside the living room door. Wow." "Oh, Terry, it's excellent." Nicky gripped his arm in excitement. They stood in the open door a moment as an apparition of beauty, or evil, crossed the room. It took Terry a moment to recognize Justine. She was dressed all in black, in a body-hugging, low-cut satin gown with high-spiked sandals. Her thick blonde hair was piled high on her head, and she had powdered her face and throat so they were dead white, except for a slash of red on her full lips and the glittering green irises of her eyes. "She looks like that dark-haired woman on TV with the horror movies, Elvira," Terry whispered. Justine paused for effect, then smiled warmly. "Welcome to my crypt," she said. "Almost everyone else is here. We were beginning to think the ghouls got you." "Great costume, Justine," said Nicky. "Thanks," said Justine. "Always wanted to be a vampire. Your costume's pretty cool, too. It reminds me of one I saw at the Venice Carnival." "The what?" said Nicky. "A big party they hold in Venice once a year. Everyone dresses up and parties through the streets and canals. That's Venice, Italy," she added. "I used to live there with my uncle. Which reminds me, Uncle Philip, I'd like you to meet my new friends." A very skinny man stepped out of the shadows beside the fireplace. He was wearing a blue satin clown costume, and his face was covered with grease paint and a sad clown mask. A single sparkling tear was glued below his right eye. "This is Murphy Carter, Nicky Mayer, and Terry Ryan," Justine said. "I'm very pleased to meet all of you," said Philip, studying each one carefully with his sad clown eyes. "We're very pleased to meet you," said Terry, shaking Philip's hand. "Your place is terrific." "Yes," said Nicky. "This is the most incredible party I've ever been to." "Why, thank you," said Philip. "We had an engineer from Starflight Disco install the lights and sound system. Justine picked out all the tapes and CDs. My niece and I, have done all we could to make sure this is a party you will never forget." "Let me take your coats," said Justine. "Come on in and join the fun. There's food over there on top of the casket, and soda chilling in that kettle." Justine and her uncle left to talk to the other guests. Terry remained by the door, checking out the fantastic decor. A couple of kids were dancing by the fireplace, and a few more were standing and eating and laughing. With all the decorations, the place looked like a movie set. Justine and her uncle must have a lot of money, Terry thought. This party cost plenty. I wonder why she wanted to spend so much on just 9 people. "Pretty weird, huh?" said Nicky at his side. "Weird? Are you kidding? It's great," exclaimed Terry. "They've spent a lot of money on this party," Nicky went on as if she had been reading his thoughts. "I wonder why she went to all this trouble." "Beats me," said Terry. "Maybe we're her favorite charity." "Lucky us," said Nicky. "Still, I'd like to know more about Justine." Terry laughed. Nicky was the most naturally curious person he'd ever known. "Hey, funny face, you can play Nancy Drew later. For now, let's check out the refreshments." He took her hand and led her to the side of the room. As Justine had said, the refreshment table was a shiny black coffin. It was covered with an appetizing array of cheese, bread, crackers, and various dips and hors d'oeuvres, including several Terry had never seen before. A shelf above the coffin held huge bowls of chips and platters of pizza, pepperoni, onion, sausage, and every combination Terry had ever heard of. Below all the food was a huge black cauldron packed with ice and dozens of cans of soda. "Look at this," Terry said. "I've never seen so much food at a party." "Me neither," Nicky agreed. "Except maybe when my parents have their New Year's party." She reached for a cracker covered with something pink. "Yummy," she said. "I wonder what it is." "Tarama salata," said Angela, who suddenly appeared beside her. She touched Nicky's shoulder and repeated the words so Nicky could read her lips. "It's a Greek dish made out of fish eggs. I asked Justine. She said she learned how to make it when she lived in the Greek islands." "It's good," said Nicky thoughtfully. "Try some, Terry." "Fish eggs?" he said. "Thanks anyway. I'll stick with pizza." He stepped back and eyed Angela's costume appreciatively. She was dressed like a biker girl, all in leather, and had stenciled tattoos on her arms and neck. "Neat costume," he said. "Thanks," said Angela. "You should see some of the others. This is definitely the most excellent party I've ever been to." While Nicky sampled something green with white swirls in it, Terry munched on pizza and surveyed the rest of the party. It was a little hard to see with all the shadows, but he could make out Tricia and David talking in a corner underneath a human skull. David was wearing his basketball uniform, only instead of a basketball, he was holding a big, round papier-mâché skull. Tricia, with her round face cheery and excited, was wearing a cheerleader's outfit from the 50s, with a tight pink sweater and a short white skirt over wide ankle-length boots. She had a big megaphone in her hand, and would have looked ridiculous, except she was obviously having such a good time. In front of the fireplace, Justine was dancing with Murphy, the vampire and the zombie. They looked gross, but also fascinating, like creatures out of a horror movie. Terry was just wondering where the last couple of kids were when he heard a strange noise behind him. He turned and gawked, then started laughing. He couldn't help himself. It was Ricky Shore, dressed as a frog. He was wearing bright green long underwear, a pair of swim fins, and had a half mask on top of his head with bulging black eyes. "Ribbit," he said. "I don't believe this," Terry finally said when he could breathe again. "You came as your biology project." "You like it?" said Ricky, taking a swig of Diet Dr. Pepper. "I dyed the underwear myself. My mom got kind of upset, though. She couldn't get all the color out of her washing machine." "I think it's the real you," said Angela, nastily. "Sort of slimy and nerdy." "Oh yeah?" said Ricky. "That shows all you know. If you kiss me, I'll turn into a prince." "I'll take my chances with the zombie. Thanks," said Angela. Murphy and Justine had stopped dancing, and Angela walked over and took Murphy's hand. "Hey, funny face," said Terry, touching Nicky on the arm. "If you can stop eating for a couple of minutes, want to dance?" A fast, hard rap song was on, and Nicky closed her eyes for a moment to better sense the beat of the music coming through the vibrations in the floor. "Sure," she said. "I'd better stop eating anyway. Terry, this is the most fabulous food. She's got things here from Greece, Japan, France, Mexico. Not to mention good old American pizza," said Terry. "Don't be a dweeb," said Nicky. She twirled away from him, then came back. "There's one thing I can't figure out," she said. "I don't see how Justine could have possibly lived in all those places. I mean, she's just a senior." "Ask her later," said Terry. Another song started, and they kept dancing. He watched Nicky proudly. Nicky was the prettiest girl there. Justine was too ghoulish, and Angela looked like a tramp, but Nicky's red dress brought out the vibrant color in her cheeks and lips and made her dark eyes glow like coals. To one side, Ricky and Tricia danced, the bilious green frog and the plump cheerleader, both of them having a great time. "This is a pretty cool party," Terry told himself. "I still don't know why we were invited, but I'm glad." The tape clicked off. While Philip went to change it, there was a sound of heavy knocking at the front door. Justine went to answer it, and everyone turned to see the late arrival. For a moment, there was total silence. Standing in the living room doorway, framed against the dark hallway, was a figure dressed in shining silver from head to toe. He struck a pose, like a matador, then strode into the living room. Now Terry could see that it was Alex, dressed in a skin-tight silver bodysuit and a glittering silver mask. Beneath the silver, his muscles rippled as he moved. What a show-off, Terry thought. Nicky gripped Terry's hand tighter, and she whispered, "Wow, he looks fantastic." Several of the other guests began to whistle and shout. Even Justine couldn't take her eyes off Alex. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said at last, "I give you the Silver Prince." Alex came the rest of the way into the living room as if he owned it. Terry couldn't resist saying something. Nicky's exclamation of how fantastic Alex looked set him off. "Hey Alex, what are you supposed to be? The Tin Woodsman? Or is it Tinkerbell?" Alex laughed. "Admit it, Ryan," he said. "You could never look this good in a million years." Terry was still trying to think of a sarcastic reply when the music started up again, and for a moment Alex danced by himself, the complete center of attention. Nicky tugged at Terry's arm. "Come on, Terry," she said. "Let's dance." She gave him such a loving look that for a moment Terry forgot to envy Alex's spectacular costume. "Take that, Silver Prince," he thought. "Show off all you want, but Nicky wants to dance with me." Even though she couldn't hear the sounds of the music, Nicky was one of the best dancers Terry had ever known. She'd once explained to him how she felt the beat through her body, but he still wasn't sure how she did it. All he knew was that he liked it. He felt as if he could dance like that forever, holding Nicky close to him, the warmth of her body against his. The slow song ended, and another started up, just as slow and romantic. Terry brushed Nicky's hair with his lips, inhaling her spicy fragrance. Suddenly, there was a noise as loud as a thunderclap. "What was that?" someone yelled. Everyone was startled. The tape switched off. "Hey, what's going on?" In the next instant, the room filled with smoke. Then the room filled with frightened cries, confused whispers. No one was sure if it was a trick of some kind, or a catastrophe. Terry was about to pull Nicky toward the door when Justine stepped into the center of the room. "Like my surprise?" she asked, her sexy body almost disappearing in the smoke. "It's what they call a flash pot. My Uncle Philip picked it up when he was a stage manager. I wanted to get your attention. Did I succeed?" A couple of kids cheered and clapped. A few were still too stunned to react. Justine smiled, then raised an eyebrow. "I promised you lots of surprises," she said. "And there will be more to come. But for now, who's up for more dancing?" The cheers and applause grew even louder. Terry found himself cheering too. It seemed that anything could happen at this party, and he was ready for it. Good. But first, I have to tell you a true story. Throughout history, people have loved to dance. But in the Middle Ages, dancing was sometimes much more than just fun. In fact, some people were said to be taken by evil spirits when they danced. They would dance faster and faster, faster and faster, till they literally danced themselves to death. I don't know if we have evil spirits here tonight, but anything can happen on Halloween. Is anyone brave enough to try some really fast music? Yeah. Let's go. Yo. The crowd was now ready for anything. If Justine had told them all to jump into a swimming pool with their costumes on, Terry thought, they would have done it. We'll see how fast you can go, Justine said. She reached behind her and flicked a switch. The candles on the wall went out. At the same time, a strobe light came on, and the music came back on, loud and fast. A relentless synthesized rhythm over electronic-sounding voices repeating, "Pump up the jam, pump up the jam," over and over. The fire in the fireplace had died down to embers, so the only light came from the strobe. In its rapid flickering, everything seemed to move faster and faster. Terry took Nikki's hands and twirled her. Everyone was laughing, dancing, shouting, and changing partners. In the eerie light, it was hard to see who was dancing with whom. Once, Terry found himself dancing with Ricky. It was fun, but it went on and on. Whenever Terry started to slow down, the music went faster. In the center of the room, Alex was twirling like a shiny silver top, and Terry suddenly wondered where Nikki was. Just when he spotted her, dancing with David, the lights went out. The tape player died down with a sad groan. For a moment, there was dead silence. Except for the faint glow from the fireplace, the room was in total darkness. "What is this, Justine? Another surprise?" asked Murphy's voice after a moment. "I don't know what happened," said Justine. She sounded a little frightened. "Uncle Philip?" "I'll check the fuse box," Philip's voice said calmly. "Don't go away." "Don't worry, everyone," said Justine. "We just had a new electric system installed, and the strobe must have overheated it. My uncle will change the fuses, and we'll—" At that moment, the artificial candles came back on, and the tape started up again. But no one felt like dancing anymore, because the light showed a horrifying sight. In front of the fireplace, half on and half off the rug, lay a limp body. Blood trickled down its sides, from the huge carving knife sticking out of its back. Chapter 6. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then, several people began screaming at once. Terry's heart was beating so fast he could hear it. The vast room seemed to spin, then tilt. He grabbed a chair back to steady himself. It took a while for his head to clear. Sounds came back. He could hear individual voices. "Oh no! No! Is it real? Who is it? Somebody! Call 911! Tightly holding Nikki's hand, Terry began to move toward the body with the other guests. He could see now that it was someone dressed in a skeleton costume. But who? Everyone seemed reluctant to go nearer. Finally, Alex squatted down. He tentatively reached out to touch the body, when suddenly the skeleton jumped up. "Trick or treat!" the skeleton yelled, and collapsed, laughing uncontrollably, back on the rug. It was Les Whittle. There were gasps of surprise. Then laughter, nervous at first, built until the room nearly shook from it. "One for the wimp side!" shouted Ricky in triumph. "Great trick, Les!" Terry clapped him on the shoulder. "It was good," said Tricia. "But you had us all scared to death. Why didn't you tell the rest of the team you were going to do it?" "Because Justine and I didn't cook it up until just this morning," said Les, still laughing. He showed them all the knife. It was just the knife handle. The blood was the kind that comes in a tube. "I found these in a joke shop, and I thought it would be a shame to waste them," he explained. "It was the easiest thing in the world." "Yeah, well, for your information, none of us was scared at all," said Murphy. "That's just the sort of wimpy trick a wimp would pull." Les wasn't at all perturbed. "Sure, Murph. Tell us another one," he said, chuckling. He put his horn-rimmed glasses on over his skeleton mask. It made him appear incongruous, like a studious corpse. "I've been hiding in the kitchen for half an hour," he said. "Where's the food? I'm starved." Most of the kids, exhausted by dancing and the scare, collapsed on the antique furniture, eating and talking. "What a dumb trick," said David, his legs thrown over the arm of an antique rocking chair. "You're just jealous 'cause you didn't think of it," said Tricia. We've thought of better tricks, David said. Much better. You'll see what I mean, unless you get some sense and go home now. Never, said Ricky. You jocks don't have a chance. You're the ones who don't have a chance, said Alex. But I gotta hand it to Les. He made a pretty good corpse. Terry didn't say anything. Nikki was sitting, turned away from everyone, eating another plate of food. He was glad she couldn't hear the conversation, because it would probably just get her mad again. So what do you think, guys? Asked Alex jovially, sitting next to Terry and Nikki on the arm of an antique wooden bench. Think your team can go the distance? We have a better chance than your team, muttered Terry. We have some brains on our side. Alex laughed. He wanted it to sound like a good-natured laugh, but Terry knew better. Great costume, Nikki, Alex said, admiring her appreciatively. Thanks, Nikki said. I made it myself. You always could do anything, Alex said. I remember that great dress you made for the freshman dance. You were the best-looking girl there. Well, thanks, said Nikki. Her eyes were sparkling, and Terry forced himself to take a slow, deep breath. He hated himself for feeling jealous, but he couldn't help it. After all, Nikki was sitting next to him, holding his hand, so why did he feel so jealous of Alex? Why did he want to punch him in the face? Say, Nikki, said Alex, teasingly, don't you think it's about time you joined the jock team? Nikki's eyes changed. She was no longer flirtatious, but sad now, and a little angry. Oh, will you two stop it with your idiotic games? I've said 100 times I'm not on either side. She abruptly stood up and walked toward the fireplace. The dance music had started again, and Terry was surprised to see Nikki ask Ricky to dance. What's with her? Alex asked Terry. I guess she's been hanging out with you for so long she's forgotten how to take a joke. Hey, Beale, you're the joke, Terry muttered. She just doesn't like the whole contest idea. Hey, man, I thought you were supposed to be such a good talker. You know, debate team and everything. And you mean you couldn't talk Nikki into joining your team? Whoa. Nikki makes her own decisions. Terry stood up. I don't own her. Wow, heavy talk, Ryan. Back off, okay? Alex leaned away from Terry and put his hands up as if shielding himself. You and I used to be friends, remember? Used to be, Terry thought. Those were the key words. He realized that Alex was reaching out to him. Alex was deliberately reminding him of what good buddies they had been until very recently. Alex was staring at him expectantly, but Terry couldn't respond. He just had a bad feeling about Alex. He couldn't pretend to want him as a friend again. Alex's eyes filled with disappointment. Later, man, he said abruptly, and got up quickly from the bench. Alex walked toward the glowing fireplace with a swagger. The song on the tape ended. Alex stepped up to Nikki and Ricky and smoothly took Nikki's hand. As if he owns it or something, Terry thought, watching with growing discomfort. Trying not to look as if he were watching, Terry kept sneaking glances at Alex and Nikki. They were dancing to a fast number, and Nikki was smiling. Does she have to smile? Terry asked himself. Maybe he should go over and interrupt them. But that would just make Nikki angry, and Terry really didn't want any kind of confrontation with Alex. He watched some of the others for a while. Ricky and Tricia were dancing together again. While he watched, Ricky said something that made Tricia laugh so hard she almost fell over. David was dancing with Angela. He was a pretty good dancer, and Terry realized that he didn't really know David. He was quieter than the other jocks, and didn't seem to take the competition as seriously as the rest of them did. The song ended, and another began. Nikki was still dancing with Alex. Enough is enough, Terry told himself. He started to cross to them when a musical voice stopped him. Going somewhere? Terry twisted around to see Justine standing behind a love seat. I thought I'd dance, said Terry. Isn't that a coincidence? Said Justine. I was just thinking the same thing. How about dancing with me? She gave him her warmest smile, and Terry felt the knot in his stomach start to dissolve. Well, sure. I'd love to. Good, said Justine. She took his hand and led him over near the fireplace. A slow tune was playing on the tape player. Terry saw Nikki whirl past with Alex, the Silver Prince, but she didn't see him. Up close, Terry became very aware of Justine's animal warmth and her perfume, a faint musky scent, different from anything he had smelled before. She settled even closer, pressing her body tightly against his. How are you enjoying the party? She asked huskily. It's great, he said sincerely. I think everyone is really in a party mood now. Good. said Justine. "It's very important to me for all of you to enjoy yourselves." "Everything's perfect," Terry said, talking to distract himself from the way he was feeling. "The food, the music, the lights. You've thought of everything, you and your uncle." "As a matter of fact, Uncle Philip's up in the attic now," she said, "preparing a few extra surprises." "How do you ever dream all this up?" Terry asked. "We've had a long time to think about it," said Justine. "But enough questions. Let's just enjoy the music, and each other." She pressed even closer to him, and for a moment, Terry forgot everything except the scent and closeness of Justine. The tape ended, and the dancers broke apart. Justine squeezed Terry's hand and went to put on a new tape. Guiltily, Terry realized that Nikki was standing by the fire, staring at him. She didn't look jealous, or even angry, but there was a strange, unreadable expression on her face. Alex said something to her, and Nikki shook her head. She started to cross over to where Terry was, but stopped suddenly, her eyes wide with surprise. Everyone heard a tremendous thumping at the door, along with a growling roar from farther away. The noise was so intense that Nikki picked up the vibrations. Her mouth dropped open and she turned toward the front of the room. Ricky pulled open the door, and the roaring became a deafening blast of sound. Then, as everyone watched in shock, two gleaming motorcycles bombed right into the living room. Chapter 7. All Terry and the others could do at first was stare in shock at the motorcycles. The riders were dressed in leather jackets and pants, and their faces were completely covered with shiny black helmets. "Oh, wow!" someone yelled over the thunderous noise. "Rad! Really rad!" Ricky shouted, his idea of a funny comment. The whole crazy scene reminded Terry of the movie Animal House, which he and Nikki had rented a few weeks before. That movie had a guy riding a motorcycle up and down the stairs. Was this another one of Justine's surprises? Terry wondered, enjoying the crazy, chaotic scene. With a final roar, the two bikers cut their machines. The sudden quiet was almost deafening. The bigger of the two riders removed his helmet and got off the bike. With a sinking feeling, Terry saw that it was Bobby McCory. Bobby's eyes were bloodshot, and he had a nasty expression on his face. "Nice party," he said sarcastically. "Yeah," agreed Marty Danforth, the other rider. He twirled his helmet in his hands as he checked out the room. "Great place you got here. Too bad we had to knock so loud." "For some reason the door was locked," Bobby added. "It's almost like you didn't want us." Justine stepped forward, her face a mask of fury. "Get out of here," she said in an icy voice. "Get out?" said Bobby. "We just got here." "I told you, you weren't invited," Justine said. She didn't sound frightened at all, Terry noticed, but was so angry her voice was shaking. "Yeah, well, we told you we didn't like being left out of things," Bobby said, forcing a tough guy sneer on his face. Now Philip stepped quickly to the center of the room. "Who are these young men?" he asked Justine. "Two clowns from the high school," Justine told him. "They're not on the list." Philip approached Bobby and Marty. He had an expression on his face like a teacher who was disappointed with his class. Terry could see that Philip didn't realize how mean Bobby and Marty could be. "If you leave right now," said Philip, "I won't call the police." "Hear that?" Marty asked Bobby, his sneer frozen in place like a bad Elvis imitator. "He won't call the police." Both boys laughed. "Don't do us any favors, man," said Bobby, and he shoved Philip hard in the chest. With a gasp, Philip fell backward and banged into the table. "Uncle Philip!" cried Justine in horror. Several of the kids rushed to Philip's aid. Nikki, her eyes wide with fright, ran to Terry, gripping his hand. "Sorry about that. It was an accident," Bobby said, slurring his words. He stumbled over a floorboard, and Terry realized he'd been drinking. By now, the other kids were recovering from the shock of the bikers' entrance. "Go home," several shouted. "Get out of here, you creeps." Bobby and Marty ignored the others. "Nice place they got here," said Bobby. "Kinda looks like your place, huh, Marty?" They both laughed as if Bobby had just made a hilarious joke. "Why don't we help him out a little and clear away some of the cobwebs?" said Marty. He unhooked a chain from one of his belt loops, and with a flick of his wrist, swung it at the cutouts over the fireplace. Instantly they fell to the floor in tatters. Terry stared in disbelief. Why didn't someone do something? Now Marty started to wreck the decorations over the window. Terry couldn't stand it anymore. "Hey man, don't do that," he said. He took a step toward Marty, but Bobby moved faster. Terry felt his head jerk back as if he'd just been hit by a truck. The next thing he knew, he was on his back, with Nikki's face, very close and frightened looking, gazing down at him. He tried to sit up, but Nikki pushed him back down. "Don't try to move," she whispered. "Uh-oh, the skinny guy tripped," Bobby said, grinning. He stared at the others menacingly. "Hope nobody else trips, or anything." Marty laughed. They slapped each other high fives with their black-gloved hands. These guys sure know how to have a good time, Terry thought. Whatever they'd been drinking or smoking had made them think they were hilarious. Justine stepped forward again. She was still angry, but Terry saw that now she was also frightened. "All right, guys," she said. "So I made a mistake. I was wrong not to invite you to the party, but everything was planned for the 9 people who were already here. If you'll just leave now, I promise, I'll have a special party, just for you, next week." "Hey, that's okay," said Bobby. "We're having a great time. Don't sweat it." He walked over to the food. Ricky, Angela, and Tricia, who had been standing there, quickly edged away. Bobby took a big bite of one of the hors d'oeuvres, then spat it out. "Yuck!" he bellowed. "What is this stuff? It tastes like fish." He turned angrily to Justine. "Haven't you got any real food here? Chips? Pizza?" "There's plenty of pizza on the shelf over there," said Justine. "Take what you want and—" "What about drinks?" interrupted Marty. "All I see here is kid stuff." He turned to Philip, who was sitting on a low stool now, looking sick. "Where do you keep the wine coolers, man?" Marty asked. "I don't drink," said Philip curtly. "I never keep alcohol in the house." "I don't believe you," said Marty. "What kind of host are you? My friend and I are thirsty." He grabbed Philip by his lapels. "Stop it!" Alex's sudden yell stopped Marty for a moment. Like a silver streak, Alex crossed the room and grabbed Marty, pulling him away from Philip. Marty bellowed in rage. Alex's triumph was short-lived. A moment later, Bobby grabbed Alex from behind, then held onto him while Marty kicked him hard in the stomach. With a gasp of pain, Alex fell to the floor and lay curled in a ball, gasping for breath. "Oh man, another accident," said Bobby, stepping over Alex. While the guests looked on helplessly, Bobby and Marty began to ransack the beautiful old living room, opening doors and cabinets and throwing everything they found onto the floor. Whenever anyone made a move to stop them, Bobby twirled his chain menacingly. They found a bottle of red wine somewhere and began trading it back and forth. "This has got to stop," Terry told himself. "They may be tough, but we've got them outnumbered." Across the room, David caught his eye and nodded in the direction of the cycles. Terry nodded back and slowly got up and began to inch toward the machines. Casually, he picked up a heavy candlestick from an end table. Nikki looked at him, her eyes wide with fright. "It's okay," he mouthed soundlessly. Bobby and Marty were so busy eating and ransacking the room that they didn't notice Terry and David on their bikes until the air filled with the sound of the engines revving up. "Hey!" Both Bobby and Marty forgot what they were doing and leapt for their bikes. "Leave those alone!" But Terry and David were ready for them. Just as the 2 bikers reached the motorcycles, Terry and David jumped off the seats. Bobby and Marty dived for the 2 boys, but came up with nothing but air. With a bellow of rage, Marty stood up and swung his chain at Terry. Terry caught the end of it with the candlestick. He pulled, and Marty cried out in anger and pain as the chain twisted out of his hand. Meanwhile, David and Bobby were fighting, rolling over and over on the floor. Bobby was a dirty fighter, but he was half drunk, and David was quicker. He had Bobby down and was pounding his face, causing blood to spurt over both of them. With another blow, he stunned Bobby, then stood up satisfied. Marty had forgotten about his chain and advanced on Terry threateningly, wildly swinging his fists at him. Terry kept ducking and moving backward, searching for an opening, a way to stop him. From the corner of his eye, he saw David suddenly mount Marty's bike, turn it around, and gun it out the front door. He jumped off at the last minute. "Hey, Marty," David called. "Your bike's gone home without you." Marty looked around in horror, then turned and ran out after his runaway bike. A second later, there was a sickening crash. "How about we do the same thing to your bike?" Terry said to Bobby, who was struggling up from the floor. Without a word, Bobby threw a leg over his bike, his face a bloody mess. "Tough guys, huh?" Bobby sneered. He glared at Terry first, and then David, with such hatred that Terry felt his stomach turn over. "You're dead meat, man. You're history. Both of you." He looked around the room slowly, menacingly. "Later," he said. With a final threatening look, he gunned the motorcycle and rode out of the mansion into the night. Chapter 8. The smell of motorcycle exhaust hung in the air. Several kids began congratulating Terry and David on getting rid of the two bikers, but their thanks were subdued. Everyone seemed to be in shock. "Nice going," Murphy said. "We did what we had to," said David, wiping his bloody face with a tissue. "Maybe they'll go pick on someone else for a while." "Justine, where's your phone?" said Terry. "We've got to report this to the police." Panic and alarm crossed Justine's face. No police." "But they broke into your house," said David. "They vandalized it, and you heard their threats." "That's all they were, just threats," Justine said. She moved closer to David, put a hand on his arm, and stared directly into his face. "Those boys are bullies," she said. "All swagger and no substance. They wouldn't dare come back after the way you and Terry faced them down." "Well, I don't know," David said uncertainly. "Really, everything's fine now," said Justine. "A few of the decorations are ruined, but so what? What's important is that no one was really hurt. Alex, Terry, are you all right?" "Fine," muttered Alex. "I'm okay," said Terry. His cheek hurt where Bobby had punched him, and he suspected there would be a big bruise, but no real harm had been done. "Thank you, all of you, for being so brave," Justine said, turning her smile up to full wattage. A look of mischief crossed her face, and then she added, "Now, are you brave enough for the next surprise?" "You mean we're just going to keep going as if nothing happened?" said Angela. "Well, I hope so," said Justine. "If we stop now, Bobby and Marty will have won. Besides," she added, her lovely face turning pouty, "I've worked so hard planning everything. We haven't even had half the surprises yet." "We also haven't settled things between the jocks and the wimps," added Murphy Carter. "Of course, if you wimps want to concede defeat now." "No way," said Ricky. "We're just as game as you guys, and for your information, our team has a few more tricks up its sleeve." "Good," said Justine. "Then it's settled. Why don't you all relax for a while? I'll bring out more food, and then in a few minutes we can start the treasure hunt." She disappeared in the direction of the kitchen. Terry was starting to get his second wind and wondered what Justine's next surprise could be. He sneaked a glance at Alex, who was leaning against the wall beside the fireplace, fully recovered from his injury. Alex caught his eye and shrugged. Then he mouthed one word: "Wimp." Terry knew he had to stay on his toes. Alex was still into this dumb contest. That meant Terry had to be too. No way Alex was going to win, after everything that had happened. Justine and Philip brought out trays with hot apple cider and cookies, and soon everyone was relaxed and in a party mood again. The tape machine was playing golden oldies from the 50s, and Trisha and Ricky began dancing to At the Hop. Trisha was smiling and seemed happy again. "I love these old songs," Angela said, clapping in time to the music. She leaned back against a corner of the stone fireplace, then gave a little shriek as it shifted and opened. Where the solid stones had been was a human skeleton, its hollow face grinning mindlessly. There were several screams, and then the sound of laughter as everyone realized it was another surprise. "I see you've discovered one of our trapdoors," Justine said with her smile. "One of them?" said Angela. "You mean there are more?" "Remember," said Justine, "I promised a lot of surprises." "Rad," said Angela. "How you doing, funny face?" Terry turned to Nicky, who was leaning back against the cushions on the sofa beside him, sipping cider. "Okay," she said. "How are you?" She gently touched his cheek where Bobby had hit him. "I'm okay," he said. "I just hope Bobby and Marty don't—" He was cut off by a surprised shriek. "What is that?" protested Angela, her face twisted in disgust. "Human brain," said Ricky. He was standing in front of her, innocently holding a dark metal box. "Get real," said Alex. "Where would you get a human brain?" "From my uncle," said Ricky, still innocent. "He runs a medical supply house. He let me borrow it for the party." Angela looked as if she was going to be sick. "Let me see that," Murphy said. "I can't take it out. We'd ruin it," said Ricky, holding the box tighter. "Of course, if you want to touch it." Alex defiantly thrust his hand into the box, then just as quickly pulled it out with a strangled cry. "Sorta slimy, isn't it?" said Ricky smugly. Anyone else want to try? Sure, said David. He walked up to Ricky, pretended to put his hand in the box, but grabbed it instead and turned it upside down. The contents slithered out, landing on the stone hearth with a sickening plop. Some brains, said David. Looks like cold spaghetti to me. Gotcha. No, I got you first, said Ricky. Angela and Alex both thought it was brains. No, we didn't, protested Alex. We were just putting you on. This is one for the jock team. The argument about whose gotcha it was stopped when Justine rang a little bell. May I have your attention? She was standing in front of the fire, and outlined in light, it was almost possible to believe she was a vampire. To one side of the fireplace, her Uncle Philip sat slouched on a stool, the artificial tears sparkling on his sad clown's face. Is everyone back in the groove? Ready to party? Justine asked. Without waiting for an answer, she went on. It's time for the next surprise. This one is a treasure hunt, but it's not like any treasure hunt you've ever heard of. A treasure hunt? Exclaimed Tricia. What fun! Get real, said Murphy. Treasure hunts are for little kids and wimps. Justine, still smiling, turned to Murphy. You might not think so when you see the list of items, she said, teasingly. But, of course, no one has to participate. In fact, it could be a little dangerous. This treasure hunt is only for those who are really brave. Hey, I never said I wouldn't participate, said Murphy. Good, said Justine, her cat-green eyes sparkling with excitement. She began passing out a photocopied list. This is a list of the items Uncle Philip and I have hidden around the mansion. She went on. There are treasures in every room, on both floors and in the attic and basement. Whichever team finds the most treasures by midnight will win a special prize. Everyone grabbed the list and prepared to rush off, but Justine's voice stopped them. One more thing, she added. Please be careful. After all, anything can happen on Halloween. Tricia found the first treasure before anyone had even left the living room. While Justine was still explaining the rules, Tricia carefully removed the food still sitting on the casket and opened it to reveal a bundle of bones wrapped in tattered blue cloth, the hand bones of a mummy. I've got a treasure, she cried. But Justine, is this really from a mummy? Supposedly, said Justine. We picked it up in Egypt. For the next few minutes, everyone checked out the ground floor. There were constant shrieks and laughter as one person after another discovered a new treasure, or a trick. This is great, isn't it? Said David, laughing, as he and Terry simultaneously walked into the pantry from opposite doors. I can't believe all this weird stuff Justine and her uncle have, Terry said. He showed David the only treasure he'd found so far, a hairy tarantula preserved in a glass paperweight. I found this in the toilet tank. I found my treasure in a terrarium, David said, showing Terry a stuffed cobra. At first, I thought it was alive because it was moving around, but then I saw it was attached to an electric motor. I'm not even sure if I want to find some of this stuff, Terry said, scanning his list. A bottle of blood? Murphy already found that, David said. He was prowling around in the front hall and tripped over a loose floorboard. The bottle was right under it. Catch you later, Terry said. David was a good guy, he realized. Too bad the other jocks weren't more like him. The thought of the jocks made him think of Alex, which made him think of Nikki, and he wondered where she was in this big spooky house. Maybe he'd run into her. Nikki looked at the list half-heartedly. Even though this was the greatest party she'd ever been to, she wasn't that interested in fun and games. The party still seemed like a mystery to her. Nothing added up. The treasure hunt, she decided, was the perfect chance to explore the mansion freely. She replayed in her mind the conversation she had lip-read while Justine was in the phone booth, and had now decided that it didn't have anything to do with the party. After all, Justine seemed only to care about her guests having a good time, and despite her weird uncle, she was really sweet. But there was still something intriguing about her, and Nikki was determined to find out what it was. She would have felt a little guilty about searching the house, but the treasure hunt gave her the perfect excuse. It wasn't even snooping. Not really. She was working her way through the rooms on the top floor. So far, none of them contained anything of interest to her. She entered a large bedroom at the back of the house and switched on the light. She jumped back, her heart pounding, as a huge glowing head dropped in front of her. After a second, she realized it was just another one of Justine's surprises. She switched the light off again, and the head was pulled back up to the ceiling on an automatic reel. After a little searching, she found a lamp and clicked it on, then smiled in satisfaction. From the perfume bottles and cosmetics on the antique vanity and the beautiful ruffled pink satin bedspread, she realized she must be in Justine's room. You can tell a lot about a person by examining her bedroom, Nikki thought. For example, take her own bedroom. Her sewing stuff and the fashion cutouts on the bulletin board showed her interest in fashion design. Her collection of stuffed dogs showed that she loved animals and hoped someday to raise them. And her rock posters showed just the sort of music she preferred. But, she realized, standing in the middle of Justine's room, this room didn't say much about Justine at all. There were no stuffed animals, no pictures of movie actors or rock stars, no hint of a hobby, nothing personal at all, except for the picture of a smiling man and woman from the 50s in an ornate frame on the vanity. Justine's school books were stacked on top of the radiator, but there was nothing in the room that could be used as a desk. Strange, Nikki thought. Justine must not take school very seriously. But then, she reminded herself, after all the places she's lived, Shadyside must seem like very small potatoes. She opened each of the drawers in a chest, but there wasn't much in them besides a few folded pairs of underpants and some sweaters. Her curiosity piqued even more by what she hadn't found. Nikki opened the closet door and was shocked to find it almost empty, except for the school clothes she'd seen Justine in. Where were her jeans, sweatshirts, sneakers? What did she wear after school? Didn't she have any party dresses? She took her flashlight, shone it around the closet, then saw a faint, square-shaped crack at the back. She remembered the trap door in the fireplace and wondered if this was another one. Excited, she stepped to the back of the closet and began to press around the crack with her fingertips. Nothing happened. Frowning, Nikki stared at the door, then began to feel around the empty closet shelves. Her finger touched a small knob, and she turned it. The back of the closet swung open, revealing another, larger closet. Nikki gasped in surprise. This hidden closet was jammed with clothing, but clothing very different from the everyday clothes she had seen. At first, she thought they might be very old clothes left by the people who had lived in the Cameron mansion before. But when she took a few off the hangers, she saw that they were new, many of them with labels from expensive designers and famous department stores in New York, San Francisco, and Paris. There were beautiful woolen suits, shiny satin cocktail dresses, colorful skirts and jackets in sophisticated styles that no one she knew would wear. A chrome rack on the floor held dozens of beautiful high-heeled shoes in every type of leather and every color of the rainbow. The back of the closet revealed 3 beautiful full-length formal gowns and 2 fur coats, 1 mink and 1 fox. Nikki couldn't believe her eyes. This was the most beautiful wardrobe she had ever seen. Were all these clothes Justine's? But when would she wear them? And why were they hidden away like this? Maybe, she decided, they were Justine's mother's clothes, but nobody really knew if Justine had a mother or not. Maybe there was another, older woman who lived here. Philip's girlfriend, or wife maybe. But in that case, why did Justine have so few clothes of her own? It's a real mystery, Nikki thought. She loved mysteries. A small bureau stood against one side of the closet, and Nikki opened its drawers to reveal pastel negligées, nightgowns, and silk underwear. In the bottom drawer was a carefully wrapped package. She opened it, not even considering that someone might catch her snooping, and was shocked to see a framed photo of Justine and a man with their arms around each other, gazing lovingly into each other's eyes. But the man was much older, from the streaks of gray in his hair, at least 40. Was Justine having an affair with an older man? Was that why she never went out with the boys from school, or never went to any of the games? Nikki carefully put everything back just the way she had found it, then closed the secret door. She was just about to leave Justine's room when her eye caught the bathroom door. She went in, and with only a small pang of conscience, opened the medicine chest. It was filled with typical medicine cabinet things: toothpaste, mouthwash, several bottles of nail polish and other cosmetics, aspirin, and a box of Band-Aids. There were 3 prescription bottles on the top shelf. Nikki took them down one by one. She didn't recognize the names of any of the medications, except a sleeping pill her mother sometimes used. But all 3 prescriptions were made out to Enid Cameron. Enid, Nikki thought. Who's Enid? Philip's wife? But no matter how many explanations she considered, the one that kept popping into her mind was that Justine was somehow leading a double life. During the day, she went to school like any other teenager, but at night and on the weekends, she had a whole other life that no one else knew anything about. But why? And why keep it all such a secret? Maybe, Nikki thought, she was just letting her imagination run away from her. Maybe there was a logical explanation for everything she had seen. She needed to talk to Terry, she realized. If anyone could figure this puzzle out, it was him. Now all she had to do was find him, somewhere in the mansion. Terry was really enjoying the treasure hunt. So far, in addition to the tarantula, he'd found 3 of the items on the list. A polished monkey skull that had been hidden inside a laundry hamper, a crystal ball, and his latest acquisition, an ivory pendant in the shape of a dagger. He found the pendant when he had opened a cupboard and was scared out of his wits by what appeared to be a bloodied, disembodied head, but turned out, on closer inspection, to be the head of a mannequin covered with catsup. After he had gotten over his fright, Terry found the pendant around the mannequin's neck. He laughed and added it to the rest of his loot. He heard a couple of other treasure hunters coming his way, then remembered that Justine had said her Uncle Philip was preparing some surprises in the attic. He searched and found a narrow staircase leading upstairs. Mounting the dark, creaky stairs to the attic, his heart thudded with anticipation and a little thrill of fear. What treasures would he find up there? What scares? This was definitely the best party he'd ever been to. The attic was small and dusty, and filled with old boxes and trunks. Terry realized, from the thick layer of dust on the boxes and trunks, that they had been sealed up long ago. He switched on the overhead light and spotted a closet door. A perfect place to hide items on the list, he thought. Grinning to himself, Terry pulled open the door, then stopped and stared in shock. No. Oh, please. No. The room went white. Terry's breath caught in his throat. He gripped the closet door to hold himself up and stared into the shadowy cubicle. Alex? Alex? He cried. Hanging from a rope was the limp body of the Silver Prince, his neck bent at an impossible angle. Sticky red blood was splattered over the front of the beautiful costume. It puddled onto the closet floor. Drip, drip, drip. Chapter 9. It's another trick, Terry told himself. Please, oh please, let it be another trick. But the silver costume was real, and the blood continued to drip as he watched. Drip, drip, drip. A steady rhythm he knew he'd remember for the rest of his life. He was still staring at the bent form of his friend, trying to get the strength to go for someone, when he heard a voice behind him. What you got? Oh, no. It was David, horror on his face. I just found him, Terry said, his voice and hands shaking. Maybe it's another trick. I don't think so, said David. Don't touch him. I'll go for help. I'm coming with you. Terry didn't want to spend another second with Alex's corpse. On the way down the stairs, they ran into Ricky, Tricia, and Les. Quickly, David told them what Terry had found. We've got to call an ambulance, said Tricia. Maybe he's only hurt. It's more than that, said David. You didn't see him. His neck. All the blood. Terry shuddered, remembering the ruined costume. He had had his problems with Alex, sure, but no one deserved to have something so terrible happen to him. At least call the police, said Les. First let's tell Justine and her uncle what happened, said David. They'll know what to do. Justine and her uncle were sitting in front of the fireplace, talking together in low tones. When the frightened guests burst into the living room and explained what had happened, Justine jumped up at once, concern radiating from her lovely face. You call the police, Philip told Justine. I'll see what the situation is. Wait, Uncle Philip, said Justine. No police. Yet. Philip nodded, and together with the others, they ran up the 2 flights of stairs to the attic. It's in here, said Terry, leading the others to the closet. He braced himself for what he knew he was going to see, and pulled open the door. There was nothing at all inside the closet. I don't believe this, he cried. Where is he? Asked David at the same moment. Very funny, said Tricia, angrily. For your information, Terry, you're not supposed to pull tricks on members of your own team. It's not a trick, Terry protested. I saw him. We both did. He was here, David added, and blood was dripping. He bent down and touched the closet floor. It's dry, he said, sounding astonished. I guess I'm not the only one who prepares surprises, said Justine with a little smile. Come on, Uncle Philip, let's go back downstairs. The others were about to follow them when Nikki came into the room. Has anyone seen Terry? She asked. Then she spotted him. What's going on? What are all of you doing in here? Quickly, the others explained what had happened. So we get up here. Les finished. And there's not only no body, the closet's completely empty. Obviously, they made the whole thing up. Did you make it up? Nikki asked Terry, her dark eyes searching his face. No, Terry repeated. I saw the body. It was real. I don't know where it is now, but it was here. Come to think of it, said Ricky, starting to sound worried. I haven't seen Alex for quite a while. Has anyone? Maybe you just thought you saw something, said Nikki. There are a lot of shadows in here. What we saw was real, said David. It was Alex. Then if he was, like you say, we've got to find him, said Nikki. Come on, Terry. Let's look in the rest of the rooms. No one felt like searching alone, so the six of them, Terry, Nikki, Les, David, Ricky, and Tricia, carefully checked behind the boxes in the attic, then crept down the stairs and began to go through the rooms on the second floor. This is Justine's room, said Nikki, opening the door. Maybe he just... She broke off with a shriek. The others crowded closer. Lying on Justine's bed was the Silver Prince, but as soon as they got near, it became clear it wasn't Alex. Ricky approached the bed first. Hey, he said. This is just... a dummy, Terry finished for him. The object lying on the bed was Alex's silver costume, stuffed full of rags. The blood Terry and David had seen was streamers of red cellophane that had moved slightly to resemble dripping. In that light, it was hard for Terry to believe he had been fooled so badly. It had been so real that he even imagined the sound of the blood dripping onto the floor. Gotcha! Alex jumped out of the bathroom, dressed in a blue robe, laughing so hard he could hardly breathe. Are you all right? Nikki asked, wide-eyed. He's fine, said Terry in disgust. His voice was shaking again, but not from fear, from anger. That was a rotten trick, he told Alex. We thought something had really happened to you. I'm touched by your concern, said Alex with a pleased smirk. Nice work, David. It did look pretty real, David said, also smirking. You mean you were in on it? Terry asked David, furious. Sure he was, said Alex. How else could we convince you wimps to waste all your time searching for my body, while you were running around trying to find the Silver Prince? The rest of the jock team finished the treasure hunt. Too bad, guys. You lose again. Nikki turned to Alex, angry now herself. That was really mean, Alex, she said. I never thought you could do something so rotten. For a moment, Alex looked hurt. Then he smirked again. Hey, he said, don't you know all's fair in love and Halloween tricks? Besides, Nikki, he added, I gave you plenty of chances to join the winning team. Come on, Terry, said Nikki, grabbing his arm. Let's go back to the party. Why don't you all clear out, said Alex. I've got to change back into my costume, so my team can collect the prize for the treasure hunt. As they walked back down to the living room, Terry's head was swimming. He liked surprises, but Alex's little trick had left him shaken. I guess I still care about Alex, Terry thought. Otherwise I would have been able to think more clearly when I discovered that dummy and his costume hanging in the closet. In the living room, Murphy and Angela were dancing in the dim glow from the electric candles. The treasures were piled up on a table by the fireplace. Want some punch? Terry asked Nikki. Sounds great, she said. I'll save you a seat. I need to talk to you. Terry brought 2 cups of punch and then settled in the love seat next to Nikki. She was every bit as beautiful as she had been at the beginning of the evening, but her dark eyes were now narrowed with concern. Still upset about what Alex did? Terry asked her. Not really, said Nikki. It's something else. Remember when I told you what I saw Justine saying the other day? You still don't think she's up to something, he said. Justine's the only person at the party who hasn't done anything weird. Let me tell you what I found, Nikki went on. And let me tell you what I think. While you were on the treasure hunt, I went into Justine's room. You were snooping in her room? She didn't say any part of the house was off limits, Nikki reminded him. Besides, I was curious. Terry, she doesn't have any of the normal high school stuff in her room. Well, why should she? Said Terry. She only moved here a few months ago. Besides, she's lived all over the world. She's probably more interested in stuff she got on her travels than pendants or school colors. She doesn't have things from her travels either, said Nikki. Her room is practically bare. except for one thing. She told Terry about the hidden closet and the clothes she'd found there, along with the picture of Justine and the older man. Right, said Terry. Well, there's a simple explanation. Justine's a CIA agent, and the guy's a Russian spy. Will you be serious? Said Nikki, but she was laughing too. Look, I know it sounds crazy, but nothing I found in Justine's room makes any sense. And I also found some prescription bottles made out to Enid Cameron. That's her CIA name, said Terry, and that's why she's having the party. She's going to ask everyone on the guest list to be a spy. Maybe you're not so far off, said Nikki. Terry, I really think Justine leads some kind of double life. Well, maybe she does, said Terry. But so what? If you're really that bugged about it, ask her. She's a very nice girl, and I'm sure she wouldn't want anyone to be suspicious of. He broke off as Justine rang her bell again. The dinging came from overhead, and all eyes turned to see Justine standing at the railing on the balcony above the living room, a gold foil-covered box on a table next to her. It's time to award the prize for the treasure hunt, she said, and I'm so happy it was such a success. Even if... She paused and smiled mischievously. There was a surprise or two that even I hadn't planned on. Most of the kids applauded and cheered, and Justine made a small bow. The prize is special chocolates from Paris, she said. Who would like to accept them for the winning team? I will, said Alex. He was back in costume and handsome as ever as he slowly walked up the stairs to meet Justine. Perfect, she said breathily. Golden chocolates for a silver prince. She bent down to pick up the gold box, then staggered slightly and caught herself against the banister. Before she could hand the chocolates to Alex, the railing suddenly gave way, and with a blood-curdling scream, Justine fell forward and plunged to the floor below. Chapter 10. She fell so fast, no one could move. Her scream echoed off the high ceiling. She landed hard on one of the dark, crushed velvet sofas beneath the balcony and didn't move. Terry and the others ran to the sofa, too scared to speak. Justine lay across the sofa, her eyes closed, her arm hooked crookedly over the sofa back. Alex reached for her before anyone else. Justine, he cried. Her eyes opened, and she slowly sat up. What happened? She murmured, dazed. Terry realized he'd been holding his breath. What can possibly happen next, he wondered. You fell, Alex told Justine gently. Are you all right? I think so, said Justine. But how? The banister, it just gave way, Alex said. How could that be? Said Justine. It's solid. We had all the woodwork checked when we moved in here. She leaned against the cushion and gave a little gasp of pain. My wrist, she said. It may be sprained, said Alex, taking it in his hands. Do you have an elastic bandage? While Tricia and Angela went for the bandage, the other kids started to climb the stairs to inspect the place where the banister had broken. But Philip was already up there, and despite his sad clown's mask, he looked furious. All right, he said in a stronger voice than Terry had heard him use all evening. It stopped everyone cold. Which one of you kids did this? Did what? Asked Murphy. The banister just... It was sawed, said Philip. He held up one end of the broken railing, and everyone could see that it had been cleanly cut through. The jocks did it, Ricky blurted out, backing down the stairs with everyone else. We heard some of their tricks were going to be dangerous. We didn't do anything, snarled Murphy. Admit it, you guys, because you can't stand to lose. Are you totally crazy? Protested Les. Why would we do such a stupid thing? In fact, why would anyone? I can think of a reason, said Alex, his face grim. Oh yeah? Said Les. What? To make our team look bad, he said, staring directly at Terry. Are you accusing me of something? Terry asked. If so, say so. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, said Alex. I just think it's funny that right after your team loses the treasure hunt, something bad happens. That's ridiculous, said Terry. When would we have had time and privacy to do it? You're probably just covering up for doing it yourself. Isn't it enough that you had to cheat to win the treasure hunt? Do you want to kill someone too? Alex came down the last 2 steps, breathing hard. If you weren't an old friend, he said, I'd... Yeah? Said Terry, angry at himself for letting this dispute happen, but unable to back down. You'd what? Nothing, muttered Alex, deciding he'd be the one to let things chill out. "Stop it! Can't you two stop it?" Nikki was standing between them and shouting at both of them. "Something terrible has happened, and all you two can do is fight about it." She turned to Philip. "Mr. Cameron," she said, "we all feel terrible about this, but I'm pretty sure no one here could have done such a terrible thing." "Someone cut the banister," said Philip, downstairs now, sitting beside his niece, "and nearly killed my niece." "Now, Uncle Philip," Justine said placatingly, "whoever it was couldn't have known that I'd be the one to lean on the railing." She put an arm around her uncle's shoulders. "I just feel so bad that it spoiled the party. All I ever wanted was for everyone to have a good time." Philip stood and stepped away, shaking his head. "Hey, no problem." Alex was at her side on the couch and slipped his arm around her. "Nothing spoiled. It's a great party." "Honest," chimed in Angela, wrapping Justine's wrist. "None of the things that have gone wrong are your fault. We're all having a good time." "Really?" Justine asked in a tiny voice. "Thank you for saying so." Now, everyone else crowded around Justine, telling her what a great party it was. Justine turned her smile back on in full force. "Thank you all so much," she said. "Maybe we just need a few minutes to catch our breath and relax, and then we'll get on with the party. After all, there are still plenty more surprises." She paused and stood up, then glanced around. "I'm going upstairs for a few minutes to get myself together. I'll see you guys soon." "Whatever you say," Alex said. He had rested one hand lightly on the back of her neck and was looking at her as if no one else in the room existed. Justine whispered something in Alex's ear. Alex laughed and whispered something back. Then Justine headed upstairs. How can Justine be with Alex? Terry wondered. Alex was probably the one who cut the banister, or at least knew who did it. "Those two are headed for nothing but trouble," Nikki suddenly said. He saw that she, too, was watching Alex and Justine. "I know what you mean," he agreed. "Someone ought to warn her." "Warn her?" Nikki's eyes flashed. "Someone ought to warn him. You may think I'm wrong, but I just don't trust her." "You just have some kind of silly hunch, that's all," Terry said, surprised at how much he felt like defending Justine. "You know what, Nikki? You're acting like you're—" He stopped himself before he said something he'd regret. "I'm acting like I'm what?" Nikki put a hand on Terry's cheek and pulled his face toward her. Her eyes were blazing, with anger and something else. "Like you're, well, jealous." Terry let it out. "Now that Alex is paying more attention to Justine than to you, you seem to think Justine is the Wicked Witch of the West." For a moment, Nikki didn't answer. Her face had gotten very pale. "Is that what you really think?" she said at last. "Look, I know you don't really care about Alex," said Terry. "But how come you're so down on Justine all of a sudden?" "In the first place, I do care about Alex," Nikki said. "As a friend, and I don't want to see him get hurt. In the second place, there's something about Justine that just isn't right. And if she didn't have you on her string, you'd see it yourself. Some very strange things have been happening." "Oh, right," said Terry, stung. "And I suppose you think Justine cut through the banister herself." "I didn't say that," said Nikki. "I don't know who cut through it. But that doesn't change the fact that Justine is playing some kind of game with all of us, and especially Alex." "So now you're going to protect Alex?" Terry couldn't help saying it, even though he knew it would make things worse. "What I'm going to do," said Nikki, her voice cold with anger, "is find out what's going on, while there's still time." She turned abruptly and walked away. Terry watched her go. Justine had a widescreen TV set up, and Bride of Frankenstein was on. Terry had never seen it, so he watched for a while. He was actually getting caught up in it when a deafening thunderclap rattled the house. A moment later, the screen went black, and all the lights went out. Chapter 11. A few kids gasped. Terry heard nervous laughter. The glow from the fireplace provided the only light. The flickering flames sent eerie shadows playing across the walls. Justine's voice cut through the darkness. "You probably wonder if this is another of my surprises," she said with a little laugh. "But this surprise thunderstorm was provided by Mother Nature, and the dark is just perfect for the next game, if you're brave enough to play." "Let's party!" yelled Ricky. "Sit down, Shore," someone yelled. Terry squinted at his watch in the firelight and saw that it read 3 o'clock. There had been so much excitement, the time had gone quickly. He was surprised to realize that in just a few hours the party would be over. He tried to see where Nikki was. He knew she was somewhere in the shadows, but decided not to push it. She'd come back when she got over being mad. Justine had begun to describe the new game, which she called Truth. "The idea is that you tell everyone the worst thing you've ever done," she explained. "Then everyone votes on whether you told the truth or not. If they think you were lying, you have to pay a penalty." "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," protested Murphy. "Do you mean you're afraid to tell the truth in front of your friends?" Justine said. "No way. I just think it's kind of dumb," he said, backing down. "But I'm not afraid." "Good," said Justine before he could go on. "You see, the whole point of the game is for us to really get to know each other. Now, who would like to go first?" No one volunteered. Finally, Justine turned her smile on Ricky. "Ricky, what about you?" she said. "Tell us what's the worst thing you ever did." Ricky stood in front of the fireplace, obviously nervous and embarrassed. "I can't really talk about it," Ricky said uncomfortably. "Hey, sure, that's not like you," someone yelled. "Since when won't you talk about yourself?" Everyone laughed. Everyone but Ricky. "Something really bad happened once, on Fear Island, during an overnight with some kids. We thought someone was dead, and—" He stopped. "I really can't talk about it." "Heavy," someone shouted. Someone else booed, unhappy that he wasn't going to hear the whole story. "You have to be penalized for not telling the story," Justine said. "Your penalty is to stand on one foot until I say you can stop." "On one foot?" protested Ricky. "I can never keep my balance." "Then it's a perfect penalty," said Justine. "Okay, who's next? How about Angela?" "The worst thing I ever did," said Angela, standing and smiling. "That's easy. I stole my sister's boyfriend last summer. I called him up pretending I was her and got him to meet me. I let him know how much I liked him. I was sorry later, though," she added. "He turned out to be a real dweeb." Everyone laughed and applauded. When Angela sat down, Murphy got up and started telling something about cheating on a math test so he could keep his sports eligibility. Terry thought the game was really stupid, and even a little cruel. He was sure Nikki hated it too. Maybe the two of them could go off together and just talk. He looked around, trying to spot her, and suddenly realized she wasn't anywhere in the living room. Puzzled, he got up and checked the hall and kitchen, but there was no sign of Nikki. With a sinking feeling, he remembered that she had said she was going to find out what was going on. When he returned to the living room, Ricky was still standing on one foot. "Can I stop now?" he begged Justine. "If you're willing to tell us the truth about the worst thing you've ever done," she said. "But I told the truth. It's just, other kids were involved. It wouldn't be right for me to tell the story. And believe me, it's a real downer. It would bring everyone down." He looked very uncomfortable, and Terry felt sorry for him. "Oh, all right. Sit down," said Justine. Her fingers were intertwined with Alex's, and she leaned her head against his chest for a moment. "Who's next?" she said. "How about you?" said Ricky. "Oh, no. I'm the hostess, so I get to go last." "How about Terry?" she said, spotting him. Not right now," said Terry. "I'm, looking for Nikki. Has anyone seen her?" "Not lately," said Tricia. "But it's so dark in here." "Maybe she's hiding," said Murphy. "Come to think of it," said Alex, "I haven't seen Les for a while either. Maybe she decided to switch wimps." "Or maybe you know where she is," said Terry. "Give me a break," said Alex. "If you can't keep track of your own girlfriend, it's not my fault." Terry had an angry reply ready, but before he could say anything, Justine stood up. "Will you two stop arguing?" she said. "You're spoiling the game." Alex continued to glare at Terry. Terry glared back, then shrugged. "I'm going to find Nikki," he announced to no one in particular. He took a flashlight from the mantel and began to climb the stairs. It was still raining hard, but he could hear Alex and Murphy laughing in the living room. "Looks like Terry's going on his own treasure hunt," said Murphy. "Maybe he just can't face the truth," added Alex. One by one, Terry examined the rooms on the second floor. By the time he'd gotten to the last one, Justine's bedroom, he was beginning to feel a little nervous. Had he somehow missed Nikki? Could she have, somehow, decided to go home? He stood in the hall a moment, shining the flashlight its full length. At the far end, rain splattered against a window, causing the glass to rattle and shake. Outside, flashes of lightning illuminated the whipping trees. For a moment, he thought he heard the roar of motorcycles and froze, but then realized it was just thunder. Nikki wouldn't have gone home in such a storm, he realized, so she had to be somewhere in the house. His eye fell on the stairs to the attic, and reluctantly, remembering what had happened the last time he went up there, he climbed the narrow staircase. He shone the flashlight around the dusty room, illuminating piles of boxes. The lightning made their shadows seem to dance and jump, and the wind caused the whole room to creak, as if it were alive. In spite of himself, Terry felt cold dread move through his body. "Stop it, Terry," he told himself. "You're letting your imagination play tricks because of what you found up here last time. This house is not haunted, and there's nothing to be afraid of. Maybe Nikki is even back downstairs by now," he thought. He turned to leave, but then his eye fell on the closed closet door where he had found the silver prints. No, there's no reason for Nikki to be in there, he thought. The feeling of dread became stronger. This is ridiculous, he told himself. It's just a closet. He reached out and slowly pulled the door open, and froze in shock. There, crumpled in a half-sitting position, was a body. It had the handle of a large carving knife sticking out of its chest. But this was no dummy, as the silver prince had been. In the flashlight's beam, there was no mistaking the staring, lifeless blue eyes behind the thick black-rimmed glasses. It was Les Whittle. Chapter 12. "Very funny, Les," Terry said out loud, hoping he was wrong. He reached out and touched him. Les felt warm. "All right, Les," he said. "Cut it out. It's me, Terry. We're on the same team, remember?" Les didn't answer. He lay there staring, not blinking, his eyes like marbles. "A pulse," Terry said. "Where is your pulse, Les?" He felt Les's wrist, then at the base of his throat. There was no movement. He put his fingers in front of Les's mouth, but there was no breath. Now, Terry stared hard at Les's chest, trying not to think about the knife handle protruding from it. No movement. None at all. "No," Terry said to himself. "No. No, 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 no. This can't be real. It's another joke. Another surprise. It's got to be." "Don't be dead, Les," he said. "Please don't be dead." But Les didn't answer. His unblinking eyes continued to stare out of his pale, pale face like the eyes of a department store mannequin. Scarcely able to stand, Terry backed out of the closet. His heart was beating so hard he could hear its pounding in his ears. Shaking, he made his way back downstairs. His legs felt weak and rubbery, as if he were trying to walk underwater, or in a dream. Please let it be a dream, he thought. He had nearly reached the living room when a light shone in his face. It was David, just coming out of the bathroom. "Hey, Terry," David said with surprise. "What happened to you? You look like you've seen a—" "Les is dead," Terry said dully. "What?" "It's true. I just found him, in the closet, upstairs." "Hey, you're serious, aren't you?" said David. Terry couldn't think of an answer, but then David's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Hey, wait a minute," he said. "You're trying to get back at me for the Silver Prince trick, aren't you?" "Les is dead," Terry repeated. "He has a knife in his chest." "And you're going to show it to me, right?" said David. "And then Les will jump up and yell gotcha." "He's never going to yell anything again," Terry said. He could feel himself starting to come out of the shock. "I don't care if you don't believe me. I've got to phone for help." "Wait a minute," said David. "Let's go back upstairs. Maybe what you saw was another trick." "No," said Terry. "Sure?" said David. "Remember how real Alex looked? You were sure that was real too." "I don't think it's a trick," said Terry, but he felt a little flicker of hope for the first time. He went back upstairs with David. As they started the last flight to the attic, Terry forced himself to be calm. "I don't want to see Les's body again," he thought. "But maybe David's right. Maybe I saw something and just thought it was Les." His hand was still shaking as he reached out to open the closet door. The closet was empty. "I knew it," said David. "This was just a trick to get me up here, right? What's next? A pie in the face?" Terry just stared at the empty closet, relief flooding through him like a dam breaking. It hadn't been real. Maybe he was going crazy. But having hallucinations was better than Les being dead. "Terry?" Now David sounded concerned. "You all right?" "He was here," Terry said. "Exactly the way I described it. I guess I must have somehow been—" He stopped talking as his flashlight beam picked up something on the bottom of the closet. "What is it?" asked David, and then he saw it too. A thick dark puddle on the closet floor. Trembling, Terry reached down to touch it. His hand came away wet and sticky, and red. "There's more," David said. Now his voice was shaking too. Leading from the closet were drops and smears of blood. Without a word, the boys followed the trail around the piles of boxes in the attic, followed it to a window in the back. The window was open, and rain slanted in, soaking the worn floorboards. A single smear of blood streaked the wall below the windowsill. Terry didn't believe his heart could pound so loud and so fast. What had happened to Les's body? Had it, gotten up from the closet and escaped through the window? Had Les somehow joined the undead in the Fear Street woods? "I'm going to look outside," David said. He sounded even more frightened than Terry felt. Slowly, David pushed the window the rest of the way up and stuck his head out into the rain. Terry crowded next to him. They spotted it at the same time. There, directly below them, on the peaked roof of a second-story dormer, lay Les's crumpled body, the knife glinting in the lightning. Chapter 13. "We've got to get him," David said. Terry couldn't think why, but he was glad to have something to do. "One of us will have to go down there," said David. He found a piece of rope on the floor and began unwinding it. "I'll go," said Terry without thinking. He climbed onto the slippery windowsill, then dropped onto the shingles of the dormer below. The wind stung his face, and the rain was blowing so hard he could scarcely see. He slipped and nearly fell, but caught the edge of the roof and steadied himself. "Hold on, Les," he said. "I'm coming." David dropped the rope from the window. Terry caught the free end, then began to inch toward where Les lay. The knife still stuck out from his chest, like some sort of growth, and for the first time, Terry realized not only that Les was dead, but that someone had killed him, murdered him. Someone at the party was a murderer. Terry forced himself to put that thought out of his mind and concentrated on crossing the sloping shingles. One step at a time, he told himself. Les's glasses had fallen off, and his skin was no longer warm, but his eyes were still open, and Terry tried not to look at them as he tied the rope around Les, above where the knife was sticking out. Then he pulled and dragged the body till it was just under the window, and lifted while David pulled on the other end of the rope. Somehow, they got the body up over the windowsill and into the room. Then Terry boosted himself up through the window. For a moment, both boys just stared at their dead friend, both breathing hard. Finally, David shut the window. "We've got to cover him up with something," he said. Terry nodded. They searched in the dusty attic till they found an old blanket. They straightened Les's body, then covered him. Now that they had finished, Terry realized they had to face the next big hurdle. What to do next? "We'd better call the police," he said. David nodded. "Shouldn't we tell everyone what happened?" Terry thought a moment. "Not till we talk to the police," he said. "After all, someone here is a murderer. We don't want him to get away." "Let's talk to Philip at least," said David. "It might be better if he makes the call." They went back to the living room as if nothing had happened. It seemed to Terry that hours had passed, but a glance at his watch told him it had only been a few minutes. The other guests were still playing truth. Alex was standing on his head in a corner of the room, and Terry guessed he was paying a penalty, but he didn't really care. All idea of fun and games were gone, for good. "Hi, guys," Justine said cheerily. "Ready for truth?" "Not just yet," said Terry. "I need to ask your uncle something. Do you know where he is?" "Isn't he in here?" said Justine. "Or in the kitchen?" "I haven't seen him," said Angela. "Maybe he's disappeared too," said Murphy, laughing. "Like Nicky and Les. Maybe there's a Bermuda Triangle somewhere right in the middle of this house." Nicky. After Terry had found Les's body, he'd forgotten all about her. She was still missing, and there was a murderer in the house. All he could think of was to run back upstairs and start searching for her again, but David clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Terry," he said, sounding almost normal. "Let's go see if Philip is in the kitchen." "Right," Terry told himself. "Call for help. That's definitely the first thing to do." He followed David into the kitchen. An open window was banging in the wind, and next to it hung a wall phone, slick with rain. His fingers still trembling, Terry picked up the phone and started to punch in 911, but there was no dial tone. "The line's dead," he whispered, wondering what else could go wrong. "Maybe the wind knocked the line loose," said David. "It was strong enough to blow that window open." "Let me look," said Terry. He unlocked the back door and peered out. The line comes in just above the window. Maybe It's cut, said David. He stepped out onto the porch, pointing. There was no question. The line hung in two pieces, obviously cut through. The two boys exchanged glances. Terry wondered if he looked as scared as David did. "Do you think the murderer did this?" Terry asked. "It was Bobby and Marty," David said. "It had to be. Who else could it be?" Terry thought it over. Could Marty and Bobby have killed Les? "They could have sneaked back and come in the window," said David, obviously wondering the same thing. No, impossible, Terry thought. The two bikers swaggered around a lot and pretended to be hard, but they weren't murderers. "Someone is," said a voice in his head. "Someone is a murderer. Someone you know. Someone at this party." The only thing he knew for sure was that they had to get help as soon as possible, and that he couldn't leave the mansion until he found Nicky. "We've got to find Philip," David said. "Then one of us can go for help." The boys ran back into the house and through the front hall. Terry glanced out a window panel beside the front door. Across the yard, Marty's wrecked motorcycle glinted in the lightning like a warning signal of doom. A particularly bright flash lit up the yard then, and something caught Terry's eye. Quickly, he ran out to the motorcycle, David close behind. Crumpled in the mud, just beneath the front wheel, was a blue satin jacket, Philip's clown costume. Terry examined the jacket. One whole arm was stained with blood. Chapter 14. "This is a joke, right?" Murphy was saying. "It's another trick." "Sure it is," said Alex. "Terry's still mad that the wimps lost the treasure hunt, and this is his mature way of showing it. Did he pay you off to go along with it, Dave?" "It's no joke," said David, shaking slightly in his wet clothes. He and Terry were standing in front of the fireplace drying off. They were facing the remaining party guests. Tentative smiles and laughs had turned to expressions of horror as they began to realize that this Halloween trick might be for real. Tricia spoke up, trying to fight back tears. "Are you telling us that Les is dead?" "Murdered," said Terry grimly. "But who?" "And Uncle Philip." Justine spoke for the first time. "Something has happened to him too." "We don't know for sure," said Terry, "but we found his jacket covered with blood." Justine buried her face in her hands and began to cry. Alex, who had been sitting next to her, put one arm around her and patted her gently with the other. Angela stood up, shaking. Someone in this house is a murderer," she said. Her voice sounded very high-pitched and almost hysterical. "Or someone outside the house," said David. He told the others about the cut phone line. I want to go home," Angela said. "I have to get out of here." She ran toward the front door, with Ricky and Murphy both behind her. "You can't go out," said Ricky. "It's really pouring now." "Besides," Murphy added, "Bobby and Marty might still be out there." "I don't care," she shrieked. She slipped away from them and rushed through the door. An instant later, there was a cry from the front porch. Murphy and Ricky rushed outside. A moment later, Ricky came in more frightened than ever. "It's okay," he said. "She fell down. She tripped on the piece of plywood Marty and Bobby put down as a ramp." Murphy came inside, carrying Angela. She was still crying, but no longer sounded hysterical. "My ankle," she moaned. "I think it's sprained," said Murphy. He set her down on one of the sofas. "You'll have to carry me home, Murphy," Angela said. "I don't think I can walk." "I'll help," said Alex. "Stop," Justine cried suddenly. "Don't leave me alone. Please. Wait till morning. We can all go for help then." "We've got to call the police," David said gently. "But there's no reason for everyone to go. There's a payphone at the corner of Fair Street and the Old Mill Road. It should only take me a few minutes to drive there." Terry thought about the walk through the cemetery to get to the cars and wondered how David could face it. But he knew David was right. He had to go. In any case, Terry had to stay there to find Nicky. "Don't worry," said David. "You'll be safe here as long as you all stay together. Don't leave the living room and lock the front door. I'll be back with help in just a few minutes." He pulled on his varsity jacket and slipped out the front door. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Angela's muffled sniffling. Then Ricky got up and locked the front door. Everyone had crowded closer together in front of the fire, and even Justine seemed lost and frightened in the flickering light. "It'll only take a few minutes," said Tricia soothingly to Angela. "As long as we all stick—" "Terry, where are you going?" "I still don't know where Nicky is," he said, trying to sound calmer than he felt. "I was looking for her when I found Les." "This isn't just a trick," said Alex suspiciously. "What do you think?" Terry snapped. "Do you see Nikki anywhere? She's been missing for over an hour." "I'm sorry, man," said Alex, suddenly frightened. "I'll help you look for her." For a moment, Terry wanted to tell Alex to mind his own business, but he read an expression of real concern on his former friend's face and realized for the first time how much Alex really cared for Nikki. Besides, he told himself, the most important thing wasn't who found her, but to find her as quickly as possible. And too much time had passed already. With a growing sense of urgency, Terry realized that it might already be too late. As he walked toward the woods surrounding the cemetery, David realized he had never been so scared in his life. He had volunteered to go for help because he couldn't stand the thought of just waiting in the mansion with Les's body there. But he couldn't get Les out of his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Les's staring, sightless face. Every time the wind shook the trees, he saw the skeleton costume. The rain was slanting down harder than ever, and he was soaked completely through. His body had started to shiver from the cold, and from fear. It was taking him a lot longer to get to the cemetery than he had remembered. The ground was deeply rutted, and now so slippery with mud that he had to watch every step. The wind had shifted and was blowing directly in his face, as if to force him back to the Cameron mansion. The only good thing was that there'd been no sign of Bobby and Marty. Maybe the weather had gotten too bad for them. The wall surrounding the Fear Street Cemetery loomed just ahead. He pushed open the gate and began to pick his way along the path between the grave markers, trying not to think about where he was. With every boom of thunder, lightning lit up the graveyard like a snapshot, the old gravestones standing out in eerie relief. It was only a few more yards to the end of the graveyard and where the cars were parked. In a flash of lightning, he finally saw them in the distance and felt a flood of relief for the first time in hours. In just a few more steps, he'd be out of there and on his way to help. At last, he reached the gate, swung it open, and began to run toward the handful of cars at the end of Fear Street. He reached into his pocket and took out his keys as he approached his red Corolla, and stopped, holding them in his hand. The Corolla was sitting at an odd angle. Every one of its tires had been slashed. Every tire on every car belonging to the guests had been slashed. Chapter 15. Bobby and Marty, David thought. He'd come all the way through the cemetery, and now he wouldn't get any farther. What could he do now? Somehow, he had to get help, but it was a very long walk back to town. A flash of lightning illuminated the houses along this end of Fear Street, and David realized he could simply go to one of them and ask to use the phone. Never mind that half the houses were abandoned, and the other ones were supposed to be haunted, or that it was too late. This was an emergency. He stood looking at the nearest houses a moment, then set out for the closest one, and was stopped by the roar of a motorcycle. Bobby and Marty, both on Bobby's motorcycle, came roaring up from behind the cemetery and stopped directly in his path. "Going somewhere, David?" Bobby said. "The party's in the other direction," added Marty. "We thought maybe you'd help us get back in." "Especially when you see what'll happen if you don't," said Bobby. Both boys' words were slurred, and David realized they'd been drinking heavily, probably since they had crashed the party earlier. "Come on, David," said Marty nastily. "What do you say?" Suddenly, David had had enough. After everything that had happened, he wasn't going to let himself be pushed around by a couple of bullies. A nagging voice in the back of his mind reminded him that Marty and Bobby might be murderers, but he dismissed it. They were too cowardly to do anything really terrible, he thought. Besides, he was too angry to think straight. "Get out of my way," David said angrily, and took another step toward the house across the street. Bobby revved his engine. "Hey, cool your jets, man," he said. "David seems to have forgotten his manners," Marty said. He had pulled the heavy chain out of his jacket, and, holding it menacingly, stepped off the bike. "I don't have time for this," David said, furious. "Something terrible has happened." "Something even more terrible is about to happen," said Marty, taking a step toward him. "To you." For the first time since Bobby and Marty had showed up, David began to be afraid of them. He realized they had been drinking too much to know what they were doing. All right, David said, backing up. "Take it easy." "Hey, what's the matter, man?" said Marty. "Don't feel so brave anymore?" "Look," said David, searching desperately for a way to escape. "I don't have a problem with you guys, so why don't you just go away and leave me alone?" "No can do," said Bobby. just behind Marty. Both bikers were so intent on violence that David realized his only hope was to get away from them. He spun around and, slipping on the wet ground, dashed back into the graveyard. Bobby and Marty were right behind him. They moved surprisingly quick, considering how drunk they were. David ran down a long path, a blur of tombstones flying by on either side of him. He was heading toward the wall, and then the Fear Street woods. Then, he caught his foot on a root and went down in the mud. He was just pulling himself to his feet when Bobby and Marty caught up to him. "Hey dude, wait up," said Bobby drunkenly. "You shouldn't run away. It could be dangerous." Marty cocked his arm back and took a swing at David's head. David easily ducked, but he slipped again and felt a sickening crack as his head hit the corner of a gravestone. He saw a bright flash of light, and then everything went dim, as if someone had pulled a curtain down over his head. Through the curtain, he could faintly hear Bobby and Marty's voices. They seemed like figures in a faraway place. "What'd you do?" said Bobby's voice, sounding frightened. "Nothing," said Marty. "He slipped and hit his head." "He looks bad," said Bobby. "What if he dies?" "Then we don't want to be anywhere around here," said Marty. "Come on, let's move him out of sight." David knew they were talking about him, but somehow the words didn't make any sense. He was very sleepy. He felt himself being dragged along the ground. The light became dimmer and dimmer, and then faded out completely. Chapter 16. Terry didn't really like the idea of Alex helping him find Nikki, but he realized it made sense. Too much time had already passed. "Please," he thought, "let her be okay." "I've already checked on the second floor," he told Alex. "Why don't you check it again in case I've missed something?" "Wait," said Justine. "I'll go. I know the house better than anyone." "I'll go with you," said Alex. "No, Alex," she said sweetly. "You wait in the living room with the others, in case anything happens." Alex was about to protest again, but Justine leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. "Please, let me do this. I feel so terrible about everything that's happened. At least let me try to help Terry." Grumbling, Alex went back to join the others by the fireplace. "Thanks, Justine," Terry said. "Please, be careful." "I promise," she said. "Why don't you check down here while I go upstairs?" Terry nodded. The only place he hadn't looked was the basement. He didn't really think Nikki would have gone down there alone, but couldn't think of anywhere else to look. As he started down the dark, narrow steps, he could hear the others talking in hushed, frightened tones back in the living room. "Please," he kept thinking over and over. "Please, please, please." This was the first time he'd gone down to the basement. Each step creaked like something alive, and he wondered if the stairs were strong enough to hold him. The flashlight showed thick ropes of cobwebs and splintered, dusty beams. It was obvious that Justine and her uncle hadn't done any renovations on this part of the house. The basement itself was jammed full of old boxes and splintered boards. He jumped as something skittered across the floor behind him. It was just a mouse, he told himself. At least I hope it's a mouse. Nikki can't be down here, he thought. He wanted to call out her name, but knew she couldn't hear him even if she was there. He heard another noise, a kind of thumping, from the far end of the low, dark space. In the circle of light, he saw a large storage closet set against the wall. Gingerly, he approached it and yanked the door open. Inside was what he first thought was a bundle of rags. And then the bundle moved. It was Nikki. She stared up at him with a dazed expression. "Terry?" "Funny face." Terry dropped to his knees and put his arms around her. He held her tightly, overwhelmed with relief that she was alive. Finally, he let her go and shone the flashlight so she could see his face. "Are you all right?" he said. "Where are we?" asked Nikki, looking around in confusion. "In the basement of Justine's house," said Terry. "In a closet." "The basement?" said Nikki. "How on earth did I get—" "I don't know," said Terry. "What happened to you?" "I'm not sure," she said. "I think someone knocked me out." "Knocked you out?" Terry felt his heart begin to race. He searched Nikki's face and saw that she had a large purple bruise on her forehead. "Tell me what you remember, funny face." Nikki pulled herself to her feet and brushed the dust off of her red gown. She squinted, remembering. "Right after we had that silly argument," she said, "I went back up to Justine's room. It was really dark and spooky, but I kept thinking there had to be something I'd missed, something that would explain the strange way Justine's been acting. I went back in the secret closet, Nikki went on, and this time I noticed the shoebox on the floor. None of the other shoes were in boxes, so I opened it. It was full of mementos, old pictures, some pressed flowers, and this. She reached in her pocket and handed Terry a brittle news clipping from the Shadyside paper. Terry took the clipping and shone the flashlight on it. In growing confusion and disbelief, he began to read. Local couple killed in fiery crash. Edmund D. Cameron, 26, and his wife, Sissy, 20, were killed late last night when their car was hit head-on by a car driven by James B. Whittle, 16. The Cameron's car, a late-model Ford, was headed south on Old Mill Road when it was hit by Whittle's car, a Chevrolet station wagon. According to witnesses at the scene, Whittle had been drag racing with another car, a Corvette driven by John McCormick, 16. The Cameron car spun out of control and into a ditch where it burst into flames. I didn't see anything till it was too late, Whittle said. They just showed up in the fog. I feel terrible about it. Whittle's car sustained major damage, while the Corvette was untouched. Neither Whittle nor McCormick, nor any other passengers, was seriously injured. Those riding with Whittle included Evelyn Sales, 15, Joanne Trumbull, 15, Arlene Corrin, 16, and Robert Carter, 14. The passengers in the Corvette were Jim Ryan, 18, Nancy Arlen, 16, and Ed Martiner, 15, all of Shadyside. The Cameron couple are survived by a daughter, Enid, age 1. No charges were filed, pending police investigation. Terry quickly finished the article. This must be the accident that killed the original owners of the mansion, he said. What a horrible way to die, burning to death in a car. Yes, Nikki agreed. No wonder it made Justine crazy. What are you talking about? Said Terry. Terry, the couple who were killed in that crash. They were Justine's parents. Terry just stared at her. Maybe we ought to get you to a doctor, he said. After all, someone hit you on the head. Oh, for heaven's sake, said Nikki in exasperation. Are you really so afraid to look at the truth? But Justine's parents, Justine, it doesn't make any sense, Terry protested. Besides, the clipping says their daughter was named Enid. Remember? That's the name I saw in those prescriptions, Nikki said. Besides, look at this. She reached in her pocket for something. It was a driver's license, showing Justine's picture and made out to Enid J. Cameron. Terry looked at it, shocked. Well, he said finally, I guess Justine isn't a distant cousin after all. But why would she want us to think she's someone else? You still don't understand, do you? Said Nikki. Did you notice the names of the people in the accident? Quickly, Terry scanned the clipping again. Whittle, he said. McCormick? Sure, there's some of the same names as some of our friends. But so what? Shadyside is a small place. Terry, they're not just the same names as some of our friends. They're the names of our parents. Didn't you see your father's name? Jim Ryan? I guess I just skimmed it. But what about the other names? Joanne Trumbull? Arlene Corrin? Arlene is my mother, said Nikki. Corrin is her maiden name. Terry just stood a moment, thinking about what Nikki had told him. He didn't want to think about what it might mean. There's another thing, Nikki went on. Did you see the date of the article? Yeah, let's see, said Terry, doing some quick mental arithmetic. 28 years ago. So Justine is... And then he realized what that meant. Nearly 30 years old, Nikki finished for him. Terry, she's not a high school student. She's a grown woman. A double life, said Terry. He let out a low whistle. I wonder what Justine would say if she knew you found this stuff. I think she already knows, Nikki said. Or somebody does. After I put away the shoebox, I started back to tell you what I'd found. Only, before I could close the secret door, someone must have snuck up on me. I remember bending down to pull the door shut, and the next thing I knew I was in this closet. She touched her finger to the bruise on her head. Terry leaned down and gently kissed the bruised spot. Thank heaven nothing else happened to you, he murmured. Nikki looked carefully at his face. What do you mean worse? She said. Terry, is there something you're not telling me? Oh, Nikki, he said. He squeezed her hand, hard. So much has been happening. He quickly told her about finding Les's body and Philip's blood-stained jacket. When he finished, Nikki was paler than ever. So you can imagine, he said. How worried I was. I thought that maybe you had been... I can't imagine why she let me go, Nicky said. She just must not have had the time to do with me what she did to Les. She? Terry said. You think Justine killed Les? Who else could it be? Said Nicky. Terry, look at the facts. First there was the invitation list. Okay, he said, thinking. So Justine invited us, the children of the kids who were in that crash. That's right, said Nicky. And only us. Didn't you think it was strange that she insisted no one else could even come to the party? Not even as a date? Yeah, I see what you mean, said Terry. I guess I'm still having a hard time believing it. That's why she's getting away with it, said Nicky. Because no one would believe that sweet, innocent Justine could be a murderer. But Terry, we have to face it. Justine had us here to this party for one reason only. She paused, then went on, her voice suddenly shaking. For revenge. Chapter 17. Nicky, Terry said, we've got to get back upstairs quick. David went to get help, so if Justine's planning anything else, she'll do it soon, before the police get here. Without another word, Terry and Nicky raced up the basement stairs and back into the living room. Everyone was sitting as Terry had left them, huddled close to the fireplace, looking scared and miserable. Everyone but Justine. She was sitting on the edge of one of the chairs, a strange look of excitement on her face. When she saw Terry and Nicky, she smiled her most open, friendly smile. Oh, good, she said, as if nothing had happened. You found Nicky. Now we can get on with the rest of the party. Get on with the party? Terry said, flabbergasted. How can you even think such a thing? Justine, we know the truth. We know you murdered Les. For the next few seconds, no one could hear anything because everyone was talking at once. Have you guys been drinking? Murphy demanded. I know what this is, said Alex. It's the last try for the wimps to scare the rest of us away. But it won't work, Terry. Forget it. Listen to me, Nicky shouted. I have a newspaper clipping. It proves... But before she could reach for the clipping, Justine suddenly started laughing and clapping her hands. Everyone turned and stared at her. Perfect, she said. Nicky, Terry, you are both perfect. You're even better than when we rehearsed it. If I weren't in on it, I'd even believe you thought I was a murderer. You mean, gasped Tricia, that this is just another... It's another surprise, said Justine. The next to last one of the evening. And I'm sorry if it frightens some of you, but what's Halloween without a good scare? She's lying, Nicky shouted. Don't listen to her. This isn't a trick, Terry added. Tricia, Alex, all of you, listen to us. Think about what's happened. What about Les? Tricia suddenly asked suspiciously. What about him? Said Justine. He was in on it too. Come off it, Justine, Terry said. Les is dead. I saw his body, and you killed him. Justine laughed again, as if this were the best joke she had ever heard. You can stop now, Terry, she said. I think everyone has gotten the point. You're denying you killed him? Said Terry. If I killed Les, Justine said, wiping tears of laughter from her face, how come he and I were just having a good laugh upstairs? But, said Terry. Justine, said Nicky at the same time. I saw your... Justine cut them both off. Come on, guys, lighten up. Forget about Les, and let's move on to the last surprise of the night. Chapter 18. I can't believe you did this, Murphy grumbled. Even worse, I can't believe we fell for it. Does this mean the wimp team wins? Asked Ricky. No way, said Alex. Besides, you had help from Justine. Like all the others, he was obviously relieved. Terry couldn't believe his friends could be so blind. Come on, Ricky, he cried. This is for real. He glanced at Nicky, who was shaking with rage and frustration. This is nuts. They all believe Justine, she whispered. We've got to convince them we're all in terrible danger. I don't think we can, Terry said. But you and I know the truth. Why don't we get out of here while there's still time? Nicky shook her head. We can't do that, Terry, she said. We can't leave them alone with her. Not when they trust her. We'll just have to hope that David gets here soon with help. Terry knew she was right. "Justine," said Nicky sweetly, "if this is all just a trick, then where is your Uncle Philip?" "Don't you remember?" Justine said, sounding exasperated. "He went out for more sodas." That was the dumbest answer Terry could imagine, but the others didn't seem to notice. Terry decided to try another tack. "You told us you and Les were just talking," he said, "but nobody has seen him. If this is all just a trick, where is he?" "I thought you'd never ask," said Justine, hopping up from where she was sitting. "Les is in the dining room, helping me prepare the final surprise." Everyone started to move toward the dining room, but Justine raised her hand. "Wait just a minute," she said. "I want to make sure everything is perfect." She turned and went into the dining room, leaving the door slightly open. "Our trick worked perfectly, Les," everyone heard her say. "Thanks for all your help." From the other side of the door, Terry and the others heard Justine continuing to chat with Les. Terry felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle. Then Justine reappeared at the door. "Come on, everybody," she said. "Everything's ready for you now." Everyone hurried into the dining room, with Ricky and Murphy supporting Angela as she hopped on one foot. In the center of the room was a long polished table with a big candelabrum in the middle. Around the table were small gift-wrapped boxes at each place. And at the head of the table sat Les. He was wearing big, oval-shaped sunglasses that reflected the candle's glow. "Find your places," Justine said. "Each box has a name on it." But no one paid any attention to the gift boxes. Instead, they all crowded around Les. Murphy balled up his fist and half-jokingly held it in Les's face. "Hey man, you scared us silly," he said. "We were actually worried about you." "Yeah," Alex agreed. "I never thought I'd be glad to see you." Les didn't answer. "It was a good trick, Les," said Tricia. "But it wasn't fair to pull it on your own team. Why didn't you say something?" Les didn't answer. Terry looked at him more closely. Something wasn't right. Les wasn't moving. Not at all. Terry touched his friend on the shoulder, and Les slowly toppled off the chair onto the floor. The dark glasses flew off, revealing his staring and very dead eyes. "He's dead," Terry said, feeling cold all over. "I knew it!" Someone screamed. "I think I'm going to be sick," Tricia said. Terry turned quickly, just in time to see Justine dart outside, slamming the door behind her. An instant later, a key turned. Terry knew without looking. They were locked in. Chapter 19. The only window was covered with a heavy metal security grate, and there was only one door. Murphy immediately began pounding on it, but it was solid oak. "Let us out!" he shouted. Alex and Ricky pulled and pried at the security grate, but it wouldn't budge. "We're trapped!" Angela yelled. "She's trapped us in here with a dead—" "Calm down, Angela," said Nicky, taking her gently by her shoulders. "Yes," agreed Tricia, her own voice shaking. "We've got to keep calm. We've got to think clearly." At that moment, Justine's little bell rang from outside the window. "Surprise," she called into them, her face close to the security grate. She was shining a powerful flashlight on her face. They hurried to the window. It had stopped raining, they saw. "Now, wasn't this the best Halloween trick of all?" Justine said, obviously pleased with herself. "Let us out of here, Justine," said Terry. "I don't know what you have in mind, but David will be back any minute, with the police." "Then I'd better hurry, hadn't I?" she said calmly. She smiled at all her guests, a cruel, mocking smile. "It's time for the last surprise of the evening," she said. "But first, I want you all to sit at your places at the table and open the gift boxes." "You've lied to us from the beginning," said Alex. "Why should we do anything you say?" "Because," said Justine coldly, "I will be very angry if you spoil my surprise, and who knows what I might do then. Now, find your places." One by one, the guests drifted to the table and sat down. For a minute or so, the only sound was of chairs scraping along the floor, punctuated by sniffling from Angela. "Is everybody ready?" said Justine. "Good. Now we will finish playing truth. Only this time, it's my turn to tell the truth, and for you to pay the penalty." She smiled her crazy smile, and Terry again felt cold. Maybe she just wanted to talk, he hoped. He'd heard that some insane people simply needed a chance to talk about the things that were bothering them. Besides, she was outside the house. What could she possibly do to them in there? "Before I begin," Justine went on, "I'd like you to unwrap your packages." She waited while the guests untied the boxes. Inside each one was an identical photograph of a smiling young couple, dressed in clothes of the 60s. The woman had dark hair, but she looked hauntingly like Justine. "The pictures are of a couple named Edmund and Sissy," Justine told them. "Now, I want you to look at the pictures while I tell you a story." She glanced around the room to make sure everyone was looking at a copy of the picture. "Edmund and Sissy," Justine began, "were just like you, young, full of happiness and hope for the future. They were full of hope, that is, until 28 years ago tonight." She paused, then went on in a sing-song way, as if she had memorized a script. 28 years ago, it was Halloween, just like tonight. Edmund and Sissy had been visiting friends. They were on their way home with their 1-year-old daughter, whom they loved very much. Their car was going south on Old Mill Road. Again, she paused. Even though he knew what was coming, Terry couldn't help listening, fascinated, as the story unfolded. "At the same time," Justine continued, "there were 2 cars full of teenagers driving north on Old Mill Road. They had just been to a Halloween party and were still partying. They decided to drag. There were exactly 9 of them in the 2 cars. 1 block from the corner of Fear Street and Old Mill Road, one of the cars with teenagers in it collided head-on with the car carrying the young couple. Their car rolled into a ditch and burst into flames. By the time firemen got there, it was too late to save them." Terry could tell from the looks on the other guests' faces that most of them had guessed the truth by now. Angela and Tricia were both crying, tears running down their faces. Justine went on, her face cruel and old-looking in the flashlight beam. "I want you to shut your eyes now and imagine what Edmund and Sissy felt that night," she said. "Imagine how it felt to be trapped in a burning car, the heat unbearable, with no possible escape, and no one to help you, no matter how loudly you screamed. You may have guessed by now that Edmund and Sissy were my parents, but you may not have guessed the names of the teenagers in the other 2 cars." She recited names slowly. Terry heard gasps as different guests recognized the names of their own parents. "None of the teenagers were even hurt," Justine said. "None of them ever paid for what they did to my parents. So I have decided that you, their children, will pay." There wasn't a sound from the dining room, except for the sniffling of Angela and Tricia. "Les had the honor of paying first," said Justine, "because it was his father who drove the car that killed my parents. The rest of you will go together, the way your parents should have all those years ago." "No!" Angela screamed suddenly. "How can you make us responsible for something that happened before we were born? It's not fair." "What happened to my parents wasn't fair either," cried Justine. "Let us go," Murphy pleaded. "We won't tell anyone what we know." Justine scrutinized him for a moment, then burst into laughter. "Do you really think it's that easy?" she said. Terry looked at Nikki, feeling hopeless. He didn't know what Justine had in mind, but he was sure it was something horrible. "We've got to keep her talking," Nikki whispered. "What?" "As long as Justine is talking, she can't do anything to us," Nikki said. "So we've got to stall her until the police come." If they come, Terry thought. David had been gone for quite a while. Still, Nikki's idea made sense. "Justine," he called. She turned to him, annoyed. "What is it now?" she said. I just wanted to know how you managed to fool us all so completely. I mean, everything seemed to be planned down to the last detail." Justine was obviously pleased. "I'm glad you appreciate my efforts," she said. "I've been planning this for a very long time, and I must admit, even I didn't suspect how successful it would be." "So all of it? The invitations, the surprises, all were part of your plan?" "Of course," said Justine. "Everything was leading up to this moment, and now it's time." Nikki interrupted her again. "But how could you do it all?" she said. "For instance, someone hit me and carried me downstairs. It couldn't have been you." "But of course it was." Justine smiled, just exactly as if someone had complimented her on her hair. "But how did you get me down to the basement?" Nikki went on. "I know you're strong, but even you couldn't carry me that far." I didn't have to, Justine said smugly. There's an old dumbwaiter system in the house. I just put you into it on the second floor and then lowered you to the basement. What about the cut banister? Said Terry. Did you do that too? Justine laughed. What do you think? She said. I realized before the party that someone might suspect me, so I arranged for my little accident. It wasn't hard at all. When I was a teenager, I studied gymnastics. She's thought of everything, Terry thought. We don't have a chance. He tried to come up with something else to ask Justine, to keep her talking, but his mind had gone blank. What about Les? Said Nicky suddenly. What about him? Said Justine. The others heard you talking to him before we came in here, Nicky said. Justine laughed, a scornful laugh. They heard me, but I'd be willing to bet they didn't hear Les's side of the conversation. But time is wasting, Justine said, her smile fading. If you will all look up toward the ceiling, you will see that I have put up some state-of-the-art speakers for your entertainment. Terry glanced up, surprised. As Justine had said, 4 huge speakers were attached high on the walls just below the ceiling. The speakers are connected to a battery-powered cassette deck I have out here. Which reminds me, it's time to begin your penalty. But what about... said Terry. No, said Justine. No more questions. It's time to get on with the rest of the surprise. Again, she smiled, a smile so sweet it was shocking in contrast with the terrible things she was saying. When I started thinking about how to make you pay, she said, I realized that I wanted you to suffer the same way my parents had suffered long ago, but I couldn't arrange a car accident. And then I realized I could easily reproduce the worst parts of a car wreck. She ducked below the window for a moment, then stood up again. I just switched on a tape that I made especially for you, she said. A low rumbling began to come from the huge speakers. Terry recognized the sound of a car engine starting up. Since I can't recreate a real accident, Justine went on, I'm going to make you hear what it's like. Hear the shriek of twisting metal, the screams of pain from the terrified victims. The sounds of the engine grew louder, and now there were new sounds, those of tires squealing around curves as the taped car picked up speed. Is this what she's going to do to us? Terry wondered in shock. Make us listen to a tape of car crashes? Is that all? Of course, just hearing the sounds of an accident isn't enough. Justine went on as if she'd read his thoughts. For you to really pay, you must also experience the pain they experienced, and die the way they died. She flicked on a cigarette lighter. I've piled a bunch of oily rags in the area just outside the dining room, she said. I'm going to go in and light them now. It'll take a few minutes for the flames to reach you. You'll have plenty of time to think about what my parents suffered and what's going to happen to you. She bent down again, then walked away from the window. Terry wanted to talk to the others, to try to plan an escape, but the soundtrack on the tape quickly grew from loud to deafening. He couldn't hear anything as the car on the tape speeded up. A moment later, there was a sickening squeal of brakes, the crunching of twisting metal, shattering glass, and then the screams of pain and terror. Over and over these sounds played, so loud that Terry could feel their vibrations in his whole body. To the screams on the tape were added the screams of the guests trapped in the living room. Their hands clapped over their ears as they tried to shut out those dreadful, overwhelming noises. It was the most horrifying experience Terry had ever been through. He didn't think anything could be worse. And then the first tendrils of smoke began to seep under the dining room door. Chapter 20. It was like a scene from a nightmare, Nicky thought as she watched her friends scream and writhe, trying to blot out the terrible sounds. Even Terry had his eyes squeezed shut, his hands pressed tightly to his ears. When the smoke began to filter into the room, the hysteria grew even greater. Alex and Murphy began beating on the window bars, clawing at them. Both boys had blood all over their hands and running down their arms, but they didn't seem to notice. Nicky could feel the vibrations from the tape through her body, but there was no terror in it for her. Rather, she felt almost as if she were standing back, watching something happen on a stage. The smoke coming in under the door was growing thicker. Nicky knew that they didn't have much time. She pressed her palm to the door. It was already hot. Somehow, they had to find a way out. Maybe if they all worked together, they could break down the door, or bend back the grating. She touched Terry's shoulder. "Terry," she said, "we've got to do something." He just stared at her, his eyes full of pain and confusion. He couldn't hear anything she was saying, and he obviously couldn't think straight. She tried Alex next, but like Terry, he couldn't hear her. He turned away and went back to pulling on the grating with Murphy. "Has everyone lost their minds?" she said out loud, and realized that, in a way, they all had. Tricia and Angela were huddled together in a corner, sobbing, and Ricky was standing in front of the door, his eyes closed tightly, screaming. None of her friends would be able to help her, Nikki realized. Maybe David would come soon with the police, but he'd been gone for a long time. So many things could have happened to him that she knew she couldn't count on him. It was up to her. Trying not to panic, and trying to ignore the growing clouds of smoke, she forced herself to think logically. The door was too heavy to break through. She went over to the window and pushed in between Murphy and Alex. The grating was thick and immovable. She stepped back and forced herself to take 2 or 3 deep breaths of the clear air coming in through the window. By now, the smoke in the room had become thick as a fog, and her friends were completely lost in their hysteria. Justine had planned her revenge well. If only there were another way out. If only there were a skylight, or a heating vent, or... Her eyes fell on a handle set in the wall. A small spark of hope jumped within her. It might be just a cupboard, but maybe. She opened the small door and almost cried with relief. It was part of the old dumbwaiter system that Justine had talked about. The dumbwaiter basket appeared to be much too small to hold a person, but Nikki was slender, and besides, Justine had said that was how she had gotten her into the basement. With a sinking feeling, Nikki realized she wouldn't be able to lower the basket herself. It was designed to be lowered manually by pulling on a rope attached to a pulley. She would have to find help, but could she break through to any of her friends? Terry was still sitting with his hands pressed tightly over his ears. She shook him roughly. When he turned at her, she shouted as loud as she could. "Terry, you've got to help me!" He continued to stare at her blankly. "Terry!" she called again. "Please! It's up to us!" She searched his face, willing him to understand. Terry blinked, and then suddenly his eyes cleared. He looked at her with understanding. "Bunny face?" he said. The tape was much too loud for him to hear her. She pulled on his arm and led him over to the dumbwaiter. She pointed to herself, then to the basket, and pantomimed pulling on a rope. By now, Alex had come over too, and both boys were staring at her as if she had lost her mind. "You can't," Terry said. "It's too dangerous." Nikki read his lips easily, but shrugged off his warning. She pointed to the dining room door, where smoke was pouring in thicker and thicker. "She's right," Alex shouted. "It's our only chance." Reluctantly, Terry nodded his agreement. Good, Nikki thought with relief. But would it work? Together, Alex and Terry boosted her up to the entrance of the dumbwaiter. She took a deep breath and crawled into the basket. It was a tight fit, but by keeping her knees tucked up under her chin, she was able to sit almost comfortably. "Ready!" she shouted, her heart pounding furiously. Alex began to operate the pulley. He could feel the ancient mechanism creaking and groaning under her weight. Would it hold her? Suddenly, the dumbwaiter basket caught on something. Looking up, she could see Alex and Terry pulling on the ropes, trying to free it. It wouldn't budge. The air in the shaft was hot and smelled of smoke. The fire was spreading quickly. If the basket didn't begin moving soon, she would smother there inside the walls of the old house. Knowing it was risky, she began to rock back and forth. She knew that it would either free her or cause the basket to fall the rest of the way to the basement. With a sudden, sickening lurch, the basket dropped several inches. Nikki felt as if her heart had stopped. Then she relaxed as the basket resumed its steady progress downward. At the bottom, she pushed hard on the inside of the cupboard door and scrambled out. The air was much cleaner there, and for a moment she just breathed. Then she switched on her flashlight and shone it around the dark, musty room. The basement was shaped irregularly and contained what seemed to be dozens of nooks and cupboards. How had Terry ever found her down there? At last, the flashlight showed the basement stairs, and she quickly ran up them, only to find that the door was scorching hot. If she opened it, she'd be incinerated. There had to be another way out. There had to be. Again, she shone the flashlight around. Something dark and furry skittered off to one side, and Nikki jumped. At last, she saw the outlines of a window and rushed over to it. Her heart sank in dismay. It was boarded up. Nikki wanted to cry. After everything that had happened, to be trapped there, to die there. Stop it, she told herself. Don't give up now. Her friends were all depending on her. Terry was depending on her. Somehow, she had to find a way out. She propped the flashlight so it shone on the boards over the window and began pulling at them. her fingernails all breaking. Finally, one of the boards began to work loose, and she could see the dark shape of an overgrown bush outside. She pulled harder and harder. At last, the board came free. The space wasn't quite big enough for her to escape through, but if she could get one or two more boards loose, she might be able to wiggle out and go for help. She began pulling on the next board, trying not to think about how long it was taking. She had nearly pulled it free when she felt a hand squeeze her ankle. Chapter 21. Nikki screamed and jumped away from the window. As she did, she tripped over something soft and went sprawling on the floor. It's Justine, she thought. Justine has found me and will kill me right now, right here. But she won't do it without a fight. Nikki twisted and tried to pull away from the hand that held her. But then, in the dim light from the flashlight, she saw that it wasn't Justine at all. It was Justine's uncle, Philip. The hand that gripped her ankle was securely tied with rope to the other hand, and his ankles were tightly bound together. A large stain of dried blood showed on his white and blue polka dot shirt. Nikki was so surprised that at first she didn't realize Philip was speaking to her. She squinted in the dim light and peered closely to see what he was saying. "Help me," he said, his sad clown's face distorted by the urgency of his words. "Please, please, you've got to help." "I will," said Nikki then. Philip stopped talking in surprise. "But you've got to help me too," she added. "Me and my friends." She began to untie Philip's hands and feet, explaining as she did what Justine had done. When she told him about the fire, Philip's eyes widened in horror. "I thought I smelled smoke," he said. "I never dreamed that even she—" Nikki finished untying him. "Come on," she said. "We've got to hurry." Philip scrambled to his feet and ran to a chest, returning with a thick crowbar. For such a frail-looking man, he was surprisingly strong. He pried the remaining boards off the window in only a few seconds. Then he lifted Nikki onto the windowsill and scrambled after her. Once outside, Nikki greedily gulped in fresh air. But there was no time to waste. Nikki and Philip ran around to the front of the house. Inside the windows, they could see the glow of the fire. The other teens were all pressed against the window grate, struggling to breathe. Philip pried at the grating with his crowbar. No, it wouldn't budge, thought Nikki, the panic rising to her throat. No, keep trying. Yes. At last, Philip pulled off the grating. Choking and gasping, the kids began to climb out, their eyes red and streaming from the thick, acrid smoke. Alex and Terry had helped the others out and were the last to emerge. An instant after they left, the door to the dining room burst into flames. Nikki and Philip led the choking, shocked kids out to the safety of the front yard, far from the house that was now in flames from the basement to the attic. Once they had reached safety, Terry found Nikki and hugged her tight, kissing her face and hair. "Funny face," he said over and over. "Funny face." Nikki scarcely was able to believe he was all right. His face was streaked with soot, and his eyebrows were slightly singed. It had been close, very close. Nikki and Terry just stood there with their arms around each other, watching the burning house send up bright orange sparks into the sky. To the east, faint streaks of light began to appear. Part of the roof suddenly caved in, sending a huge shower of sparks all over the lawn. Everyone moved back to the very edge of the yard. An instant later, David stumbled out of the Fear Street woods. "So I guess Marty and Bobby were too drunk to know what they were doing," David was explaining. "When I finally woke up, I was in a storage shed at the corner of the cemetery. I went over to the nearest house and called the police." David had a huge bruise on his forehead and patches of dried blood on his cheeks, but he seemed to be all right. In fact, everyone was. Everyone but Les. Tricia and Ricky both were sitting and watching the fire almost as if nothing had happened to them. Murphy and Angela were sitting in the tall grass, ignoring how wet it was, comforting each other. Alex was standing off by himself, a sad look on his face, the beautiful silver costume ripped and streaked with soot. Terry couldn't believe it. How could so much happen in so short a time? He had a feeling that everything that had happened in that house that night had changed all of them, forever. The faint wail of a siren began to sound in the distance. Philip stood in front of the group of them, and Terry was surprised to see there were tears in his eyes. "I'm so terribly, terribly sorry," he told them. "I'd never meant anything like this to happen. You must believe me." "What do you mean?" said Alex angrily. "We were almost killed in there." "All I wanted was to frighten you," said Philip. "Nothing more." Terry thought he was beginning to understand, and the knowledge enraged him. Are you saying this was your idea all along? He demanded. Yes, Philip said in a shamed voice. You see, Justine's father was my older brother. He was the closest person to me in the world. After he died, I vowed to raise Justine so he'd be proud of her. But I could never get over his death, and I guess through the years I must have communicated my bitterness to Justine. I see now that I should have taught her forgiveness and love. Instead, I taught her hatred and the desire for revenge. Then you planned this all these years, said Tricia, sounding horrified. No, not at all, said Philip. He stopped and wiped his hand over his face. Last year, I became ill and decided to spend my last days in my brother's old home. I told everyone I was a distant cousin so they would leave me alone. But when Justine found out I was here, she left her boyfriend and career and moved in with me. She convinced me that I could never die in peace until I avenged my brother's death. Terry stared at Philip in horror. Everything he was saying sounded like someone's nightmare. Yet, it was all true. You know the rest, Philip went on. Justine enrolled in high school, while I researched the original party and traced the sons and daughters of the teenagers involved in the accident. Then we sent the invitations. How could you do it? Alex asked. How? None of us ever did a thing to you. I know it, said Philip. And perhaps I was a little crazy to have carried a grudge for so long. But you must believe me. I never intended any real harm to come to you. I only wanted you to know terror, to know suffering for a while. But Justine took your plan one step too far, didn't she? Said Nikki. In contrast to Alex, Nikki's face and voice showed nothing but sympathy. I didn't realize how obsessed she had become, Philip said, nodding in agreement. Until I found the body of your friend Les. I knew Justine had done it, and I knew I must stop her. I hid his body on the roof so no one would find it. And then I confronted my niece with what she had done. I told her we must stop the party at once. I told her I was going to call the police. But she... He stopped speaking and began to sob. She attacked you, said Nikki. I know. She did it to me too. I never expected her to act against me, said Philip. She stunned me with a blow to the head, and then she must have dragged me down to the basement and tied me up. Are you telling us that Justine did all this herself? Killed Les? Knocked you out? Alex was plainly disbelieving. You must understand, said Philip, that Justine is very strong. I think she worked on building up her strength so she would be capable of anything. I believe she always knew she would do something like this. How dare you? Everyone turned at the sound of Justine's voice. She was standing at the edge of the garden, her lovely face almost unrecognizable beneath the madness and rage. Justine, Philip cried. In spite of everything he had told them, Terry could see how much he still loved his niece. You have betrayed me, Justine shouted at him. Even worse, you've betrayed my parents. I should have killed you when I had the chance. No, cried Philip, sinking to his knees. Don't say that. I should have known you were too weak to do what had to be done, she said. No one was ever as strong as I was. I planned the perfect revenge, and it would have succeeded. It nearly did succeed. She glared at all of them with pure hatred. Terry looked away. Nikki gripped his hand more tightly. We're safe now, he told himself. She can't hurt us anymore. But he jumped in fright, as did everyone else, when Justine suddenly ran directly at them, her green eyes blank with madness. Just before she reached them, she suddenly veered to the left, and then, moving faster than seemed possible, ran up to the front steps and onto the burning porch. Chapter 22. No! A single anguished wail from Philip split the air. Terry froze when Justine had swerved and headed back to the burning house. But as soon as she reached the steps, he began running too, almost without realizing he was doing it. Running after her, running toward the heat and the flames. From the corner of his eye, he sensed motion, and just as he reached the steps, he saw that Alex too was running after Justine just behind him. Without slowing down, Terry ran up the steps and onto the blazing porch. Justine was standing just at the entrance to the house, swaying slightly, her clothes beginning to burn. She turned around, and when she saw Alex and Terry, her eyes widened and she started into the house, which had become an inferno of flame. "Grab her!" Alex shouted. Terry reached out and grabbed for Justine. He got her arm and pulled with all his strength. But with the strength of the insane, she lunged in the opposite direction, pulling him into the house with her. Both of them tumbled onto the burning floor. Terry screamed as he saw the flames, spreading to within inches of where he lay. The next thing he knew, someone had grabbed him and was rolling out of the house, down the steps, and into the mud. Someone rolled him over and over, the cool mud soothing the heat. He stood up, dazed, to see Alex standing over Justine, beating out her flaming clothes with his silver jacket. Justine was sobbing now, not in insanity, but in defeat and pain. Alex came over and bent over Terry, his pale face frightened and drawn. "Hey man," he said. "You all right?" Terry nodded. "You saved my life, Alex. Thanks." "You tried to save all our lives," Alex said, putting a hand on Terry's shoulder. "I guess we were just too stubborn to listen." For a moment, the two boys just stared at each other, and Terry saw something he had never expected to see again, the look of friendship and respect. He hoped that his face showed the same things. A moment later, the yard filled with the flashing lights and wailing sirens of emergency vehicles. Nikki stood close beside Terry, holding onto his arm as if she would never let go. "What do you think will happen to Justine?" she said. "She will get the help she needs," said Philip, sadly. "I should have seen that she had it long ago." They watched as Justine was strapped onto a hospital gurney. A few minutes later, the police ambulance pulled out of the yard, its sirens wailing. Overhead, a shower of sparks erupted, illuminating the ruined skeleton of the Cameron mansion. Behind the black smoke, the red morning sun made its first appearance. "Hey, we made it all night! It's morning!" Ricky cried. "It isn't Halloween anymore." "I don't know about that," said Nikki, holding on to Terry's arm as they began to walk away. "It's always Halloween, on Fear Street." The end.